Good morning. I'm Randy Fiorini, Vice Chair of the Delta Stewardship Council, pinch hitting for our Chair, Susan Tatayan, who called about 45 minutes ago in traffic on I-80 east of Sacramento, unsure when she would arrive. So I'd like to call the meeting to order and begin with our roll call.
Weinberg, aye. Weinberg, present.
Moranian, present.
Fiorini here. Villegas is here. We have four. We have a quorum. The first item on the agenda will be a walking tour of the Big Break Regional Shoreline. The supervising naturalist, Mike Moran, is here. We thank you, Mike, for allowing us to conduct our meeting here today. Mike will lead us on a walking tour. It'll last probably 40-45 minutes. For those of you that are following us on the webcast, I would suggest that you tune back in after we leave on the walking tour. Probably about 10 o'clock would be a good target to check back in and see if we're seated and ready to go. So with that, Mike, thank you again, and we look forward to the tour.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody to Big Break Visitor Center.
Like that? How about that? Live and learn. Old dog, new tricks. Welcome to Big Break, everybody. My name is Mike Moran. I'm a supervising naturalist. We're going to try to keep everybody right on schedule today, so we'll take a walk and talk as we go along. We're going to head from here, walk about a quarter mile on out to the shoreline, to the area we call the Delta Discovery Experience. It's a bit of a stylized landscape to give perspective on something that's a little tough to gain perspective on sometimes, especially if you're from the East Bay where you have hill and dale just to walk up and see where you are. There's not a lot of opportunity to do that out here. So we have this facility out on the waterfront, and it's a lovely way just to get a feel of the Delta locally as well as in a larger sense. It'll take maybe 5 minutes or so to get out there, but I invite any questions along the way, and we're going to try to hustle you back in here. We're going to shoot for 30 minutes, so we'll be on kind of a quick pace. Sound good?
Great, Mike, thanks. And the public is welcome to join us. So with that, we will head outside and be tuning back in about 10 o'clock. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, everybody, and thanks to the council for coming in today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. I am sorry that I missed the tour and sorry for being late. Welcome back. Everyone looks refreshed and windswept, and so we'll move on to agenda item 4, our workshop on the preliminary draft of the ecosystem amendment. Councilmember Weinberg has shared with us some questions, and what I'd like to do is go ahead and proceed with the workshop and presentation. Let's see how many of his questions are answered, and for those that are not answered, we'll cover them in conversation. And does everybody have a copy of the questions? No, you don't? Well,
I think it's right here. Well, you can see mine.
okay. All right. Well, Jessica, did you want to kick us off?
Yes, I kick us off here. Thank you so much. And thank you to Mike Moran for that wonderful tour. I think part of the reason we wanted to have this discussion here in Oakley at Big Break Center is to really illustrate a success story of restoration as a local asset, not just a state and ecosystem asset, but something that can be many things to many people. And we'll touch upon that later as we highlight how the Delta Plan seeks to advance social aspects of restoration projects and societal benefits, aside from simply biological benefits. So we're here today because the state currently has no comprehensive long-range restoration strategy for the Delta ecosystem. Many agencies have dispersed responsibilities relative to the ecosystem. There are projects, there are programs, but the Delta Plan is the document to lay out a cohesive strategy to achieve the vision of California's Delta Reform Act. At the time the council adopted its original Delta Plan, the state-led Bay Delta Conservation Plan was considering a strategy to restore over 100,000 acres in the Delta, a very ambitious multi-decade strategy. At the time, the legislature envisioned that this Bay Delta Conservation Plan, the BDCP, would become part of our Delta Plan. Therefore, the council's 2013 ecosystem strategy focused on identifying and preserving opportunities in the areas of highest restoration value in the Delta, working in concert with some of the concepts that were laid out in the BDCP, and for calling for restoring natural functional flows through the Delta in support of native species. Both of those were very significant strategies, and both are still highly relevant 6 years later. But the BDCP ended. Its restoration targets and strategies did not become part of our Delta Plan. And instead, in 2015, the administration announced a downsized restoration program, EcoRestore. This is primarily composed of mitigation acres to offset operations of the state and federal water projects. These are important projects, but they are required restoration from previous regulatory requirements. And they mainly encompass projects that have been in the pipeline, some for over 10 years. You heard mention on the tour of Dutch Slough being a prime example. It's more of a set of projects than a comprehensive plan, and as we stand here today, it's a little uncertain what the future of the EcoRestore program will be. An aggressive deadline for these EcoRestore projects was set by the Brown administration. This had a great effect, along with concerted agency effort to get these projects permitted and some of them on the ground. It was really agency collaboration, public outreach, and administration focus, including a point person, that made it possible for those projects to finally gain momentum and to see some progress with eco-restoration in the Delta. Also, since 2013, following on the Delta Plan recommendation, the State Water Board has made progress in updating the flow requirements for the Bay Delta. The San Joaquin River is almost done, and the Sacramento system is underway. The board caught the attention, however, and the ire of many water users when they proposed a 40% unimpaired flow target as the new regulatory standard for the lower San Joaquin River, and 55% has been considered for the Sac Valley. So out of fear for the impacts of those significant water supply cutbacks, water users and others, including water users who rely on the Delta, have really rallied under the leadership of first the Brown administration and now the Newsom administration around an alternative approach to compliance, one that would still provide additional flows for the environment, but also include restoration actions. This will be to maximize outcomes for the ecosystem. If you have a bunch of water that you send down the system and it's not ever touching the land because it is channelized in the system, you're going to limit the benefits of those restorative flows. This whole process is called the Voluntary Agreements. You may have heard reference to it before, and these are still underway. It's clear that all of these policy approaches to restore the Delta ecosystem include trade-offs. Some of those we will discuss today. More flow for the environment often means less water for human uses. More restoration equals land conversion, and that can have localized and statewide economic impacts that must be considered. All must be balanced and pursued intentionally. So in 2019, we've sharpened our pencils to update our ecosystem chapter. This is based on what we see as the best available science. It still includes more natural functional flows, but without connecting those flows to the land the way they once were, the benefits will be limited. So you'll hear reference today, as you did in April, about the importance of the land-water connection. Without this connection, native species, fish especially, are starving to death. They lack places to breed, to hide from predators, and sufficient food supply. The right kind of habitat in the right places can provide this. We do not seek to return to the historical delta. We seek to approximate some of the ecosystem's natural functions on the modern landscape. The good news is we know how to do this. We know how to get back some of these historic functions. We are not currently, as a state, fast at getting projects on the ground and at getting the right projects on the ground in the right places. So without the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, with the future of eco-restore to be determined, the state really needs leadership on this issue, and the state needs a Delta Plan. And the Delta Plan needs to be a comprehensive, cohesive strategy for restoration. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to staff. We're going to start the presentation, pausing frequently for discussion and questions.
All right, thank you, Jessica. And could we have the PowerPoint up, please? All right, thank you. Good morning, I'm Jeff Henderson, Deputy Executive Officer for the Stewardship Council. I'm going to be joined today by Jessica Law, Avery Livingood, and Ron Melser, who are going to lead our presentation. Again, at today's meeting, what we're really doing is seeking feedback on the full preliminary draft of the ecosystem amendment for the Delta Plan. This includes a substantially updated narrative, policies and recommendations that we discussed at our previous meeting, a series of technical appendices, and now performance measures to be reviewed for the council and the public. And just as an overview to the entire presentation, I would note that these materials are preliminary at this point, and they're going to be used with public input and with council input to inform the future development of a project description for analysis under the California Environmental Quality Act in the future for the ecosystem amendment. So these are preliminary discussions. They don't reflect any final action on the council, and this is but one of many of the early opportunities for public input. So today I'm going to give a bit of an overview, illuminating some of the issues that Jessica Pearson just mentioned and framing some of the key policy issues that are before us. Jessica is going to revisit our core strategies that we discussed at the previous meeting, today with a focus on connecting these priority issues to the strategies that we're proposing. Avery will review the changes that have been made since the April meeting to the policies and recommendations that have been discussed before the council. And Ron today will introduce the performance measures that are proposed by staff to track our progress. So where we're at today, the slide before you illustrates kind of the stages that we've laid out for the amendment process for the ecosystem chapter. They began with stakeholder consultations roughly a year and a half ago now. So that's this project at this point reflects the work, staff's work over the course of about a year and a half to prepare us for today. Began with stakeholder consultations at the beginning of last year, continued with the preparation of 3 synthesis papers summarizing the best available science that informs the amendment, technical analyses and maps that have been prepared that have been reviewed in previous council meetings, and council member input through a variety of different forums at different council meetings over the course of the last year and a half. The draft amendment that you have before you today is the result of those efforts. And following our discussion today, it's our intent to incorporate council comments, potentially begin a 30-day public review process for the full preliminary draft, following that public review process to return to the council to discuss those inputs and potential revisions prior to launching our CEQA process, and then in the winter, following public review of the CEQA document, in the wintertime, we would then return to the council next year for potential approval and certification of the amendment. So the ecosystem amendment includes reference to what we are referring to as a call for action. And this really underscores the urgency of the need that we're trying to address, as Jessica had summarized. And as this presentation is going to discuss in greater detail, the Delta is a unique ecological resource. At one time, it was a highly productive estuary and a core component of a biological landscape of truly global importance. And it's been greatly impaired. It's lost what was its inherent resilience, which in turn led to a loss of ecosystem function, and in turn led to a loss or resulting species declines. The attempt that we're making or the strategy that we lay forth in the amendment sets forth a call to action to attempt to change the course of that decline. and to do it through a strategic approach which operates on multiple levels. The structure of the plan chapter is to present 5 core strategies. These address issues that Jessica mentioned, such as flows, ecosystem restoration, land-water connections, stressors, and the important institutional coordination and interagency work that needs to be done in order to help change the course. And the draft chapter provides a vision for the future of the Delta ecosystem that again reflects that changed course. Rich guidance on ecosystem restoration, including that vision, planning objectives and detailed analysis, priority habitat restoration areas that need to be preserved, and other strategies to help further our restoration goals. It also includes the preliminary draft policies that would be implemented through our covered actions process and preliminary recommendations to help coordinate initiatives among agencies, particularly through the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, or DPIC. And then now we're also introducing performance measures, which give us a means to track and measure and to adaptively manage our attempts, our strategies to move these objectives forward. Those performance measures include today a habitat restoration measure to realize a net increase of roughly 60 to 80,000 acres of restored natural communities on the landscape. And that is a performance measure that we'll be unpacking throughout the course of our presentation today. Through our presentation today, we'll be referring to a number of items that are before you in your staff report, and I'll just briefly orient everyone to those materials, as we'll likely be flipping through them as we're engaged in discussion today. The first is Attachment 1, which presents the preliminary draft narrative that we'll be summarizing. Attachment 2 provides the changes to the policies and recommendations that were discussed at the April meeting. Attachment 3 presents the preliminary draft performance measures that we'll be discussing toward the end of our presentation today. And Attachment 4 includes appendices that support all of these other components, with particular attention today to Appendix 2, which you also reviewed at the April meeting, which provides supporting materials for our proposed policies. I should also note, as mentioned at the beginning, the Council also has the memorandum from Councilmember Weinberg for discussion, and should also call everyone's attention to a letter that was received by the Council from the Delta Protection Commission, summarizing comments from the Commission on the amendment. Both of those are likely to be a part of our discussions today. This slide identifies ultimately the structure of the narrative that we're setting forward. And the narrative sets out some history regarding how the system became degraded, the key threats and stressors behind the call to action that we've summarized, summarizes the best available science addressing each of those threats and stressors, sets a vision for the restored ecosystem, and describes core strategies, again, a strategic approach to address those threats and stressors. The narrative essentially sets a policy basis that supports the Council's actions in moving forward with the policies, recommendations, and performance measures that follow it. And it bridges the scientific basis to the vision, to the policy need, to the strategic solution. So the narrative serves a very key function in tying those pieces together to ensure that what we're proposing ties all the way back to the best available science on the issues. Before we discuss those policy implications of the amendment, let's begin a little bit with some background. As you know, prior to the 20th century, the Delta was a vibrant ecological region with many different types of habitats, thriving populations of native species. Since that time, the biological diversity of the Delta has been reduced by modern development and settlement. It's estimated that today only about 10% of the natural and native species habitat in the Delta remains. And several species of both flora and fauna are listed as threatened or endangered, including salmon, Delta smelt, and sturgeon. We'll review those and other species in a bit. So, what has changed? The Delta ecosystem now has become a significantly altered and degraded system, and it requires a lot of management. The earliest large-scale changes to the Delta took place when the federal government in the 1850s incentivized people to essentially reclaim or drain delta lands for agricultural use. In doing so, eliminating the largest wetlands on the Pacific Coast Flyway. About 2 million acres worth of Tule Marsh were converted. Because of these incentives from the federal government and due to other factors at the time, including California's gold rush, much of the landscape was reshaped through the construction of levees, converting what were seasonally inundated marshlands to highly productive farmland. Today, farming remains the primary use of land in the Delta, and it's a defining aspect of Delta culture. It also provides social and economic benefits of tremendous value to society. In the mid-1900s, California's rivers were also dammed, altering flows into the Delta, which introduces the flow components of our perspective. This result is a highly altered system that requires it to be highly managed. Which brings us ultimately to the Reform Act of 2009. Following decades of ecosystem decline and a number of previous focused attempts to correct it, the Delta Stewardship Council, this body, was formed through the Delta Reform Act in 2009 to provide direction for the long-term future of the Delta. The DRA established the need for a comprehensive approach to governance addressing these challenges. It created an independent council, this body, a new conservancy to focus on the Delta, and it reformulated some functions and roles of the existing Delta Protection Commission. It also established new state policy for the Delta that introduced concepts such as the co-equal goals, reduced reliance on the Delta, the use of best available science, and adaptive management, all topics that we discuss frequently in these meetings. Our role with regard to the ecosystem is to set a long-term vision for the Delta that achieves the co-equal goals by developing the legally enforceable master plan, the Delta Plan, which was adopted in 2013. It's been updated many times since. Essentially, while there are ecosystem programs and while there are ecosystem projects that enhance and restore the ecosystem in the Delta, there is no comprehensive plan for those efforts other than the Delta Plan. This is the comprehensive plan for those efforts. Chapter 4 of the Delta Plan is dedicated to protect, restore, and enhance the Delta ecosystem. And the Reform Act directs the Council also to incorporate a number of specific ecosystem restoration strategies that are embedded in the Act itself and noted on page 4-4 of Attachment 1, which is a portion of the narrative in your packets. The Reform Act provides more guidance on ecosystem than any other topic that we addressed. As one of the specific requirements that the Reform Act introduces, it requires the Delta Plan to include measures that would promote conditions that are conducive to meeting or exceeding the goals in existing species recovery plans and state and federal goals with respect to doubling salmon populations. And at the time this was adopted, there was significant focus on that salmon doubling goal. And while we acknowledge that over the past decade, some have questioned the feasibility of the doubling goal, it's our statutory obligation, and therefore the plan includes it. The ecosystem is not based solely on the doubling goal, however. The approach and targets that are established for restoration are also based on a range of species recovery plans, and the actions that we take to support salmon also support other species of concern. 10 recovery plans and conservation strategies were reviewed by staff and have been leveraged in developing the approach and restoration targets that we're discussing and presenting today. These plans cover a range of important species of concern. They are formally adopted standards related to listed species, and there's little flexibility really in implementing them. And so ultimately, what we're presenting is a combination of the recovery plan efforts and the salmon doubling goal. There are, as we mentioned earlier, a growing number of species of concern in the Delta. Again, an outcome of the degraded ecosystem. We're now seeing the impact of those at the species level. And this slide illustrates a few of the species that are among those of special concern in the Delta. Today, there are 35 plant species of concern with a California rare plant ranking of 1B or 2B, which means they're considered rare, threatened, or endangered by California, or within California by the Native Plant Society. 28 of those species are endemic to California, indicating the uniqueness and biodiversity that the Delta region provides. 7 of those species also have a federal special status designation. And then, as also noted in the slide, there are 12 fish species, 47 bird species, 9 mammal species, 4 reptiles, 3 amphibians, and 11 invertebrates that are also in this categorization. 25 of these fish and wildlife species are listed as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. 15 bird species are listed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a bird of conservation concern, and 62 have a special status under state regulations. 28 of these fish and wildlife species are endemic or unique to California. These species are subject to a number of the threats and stressors that we've summarized previously regarding flows, land-water connections, and other issues that can be reduced through habitat restoration. So again, the restoration strategy is a means of creating the habitat necessary to assist these species in recovering. As such, one of the other DRA statutory requirements is that the Delta Plan is required to include measures that would reduce threats and stresses on the ecosystem. Those threats and stresses to the ecosystem have been, again, this is a part of this significant degradation of the system over the last 150 years from the factors that we mentioned previously. Those threats and stresses include the loss of natural communities, which begins from the effects of widespread construction of levees, as well as reclamation and dredging. They include the loss of land-water connections, which is influenced by the invasion of invasive species into the delta, as well as the widespread land conversion we mentioned earlier. Another threat and stress is the alteration of the delta's hydrology, and this is through the flow alterations introduced, both in terms of the levee system that was constructed, as well as what's needed to support California's water supply infrastructure. Predation is also a potential threat and stressor, and really can be viewed both as a cause or as an effect, again, depending on your ecological perspective. Ultimately, these are the factors that feed our core strategies. So the loss of natural communities really feeds our core strategy 2 and core strategy 3 that we'll be discussing. Loss of land-water connections really feeds core strategies 1, 3, and 4. And the alteration of delta hydrology feeds core strategy 3. And in our presentation on the core strategies, we'll then be making those back connections back to the threats and stressors that are most relevant to each one. Again, as a result of the historic landscape shifts from tidal marsh to ag land mentioned earlier, and the effects of the threats and stressors, the ecological footprint of the delta, in the form of functional corridors and land-water connections as key indicators of that footprint, has been dramatically reduced, as is shown in the diagram here regarding the state of the modern delta. This is a diagram I think we've used in previous settings, and can give you an indication of the extent and nature of the reduction of that ecological footprint. It's also, as we mentioned, really contributed to a degrading of the ecosystem's resiliency to change. As the ecosystem itself has been adapted, the ability of the species that utilize that ecosystem, the ability of the habitat to adapt to change has been reduced as a result of these other factors. And that reduction in resiliency is particularly acute when we start to consider what the effects of climate change will do to the delta ecosystem. And yet another provision of the Delta Reform Act requires that restoration must account for that future impact of climate change and sea level rise. And in the amendment that's before you, we have offered approaches to address this in Core Strategy 3 and Policy ERP 2. It's also a function of our climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategy that is ongoing.
Jeff, if it pleases the chair, maybe we want to pause there and see if there are questions.
That would be fine.
Any questions, Randy?
I just want to make a comment. I think Jeff has done a marvelous job of giving us an overview of the conditions, the history, and the challenges. I wish that we could capture that recording and use it as an informational piece. Really well done.
Since my name got mentioned a few times, I thought I should say something. I completely agree with Randy. You know, Jeff, part of what I'm trying to get with those questions is to pull out these key issues, you know, what's driving the vision, and maybe not shy away from asking some tougher questions. So you really kind of, I mean, you brought up the issues. So it's really, you know, partly understanding that clearly, and so the public clearly understands it, but also for us, okay, what are the key policy questions? And you know, I've kind of gotten briefed periodically from the staff on this, and I just have to let my fellow council members and the audience know what a tremendous job staff has done in putting this together and getting their arms around another, like, not easy to comprehend issue, and really thoughtfully coming up with what they think that, as Jessica said, the grand strategy should be. And now my belief is it's for us as the council to kind of ask, make sure we understand what's driving this, and then ask some of what we think are the key policy questions. And you know, because to me, and maybe in the context of this, to me, the headline is a certain number of restored acres, and there's going to be a cost associated with those restored acres, and we need to understand and ask questions and talk about how we got to that number. So just kind of background. So thank you, and I, you know, appreciate the attention. I was hoping that this would facilitate this kind of discussion.
Okay. If we'd like to continue, I was going to present just a very quick summary again of the vision for the ecosystem amendment, and then rely on the rest of the team here to summarize the specific components as we've discussed. So again, the narrative is the home for the vision for the future ecosystem in the Delta to address the challenges that we just described. And again, by way of reminder, the goal of this restoration is not to return to the 1850s unaltered tidal landscape. Rather, it's to create some of those historical conditions that make more room for fish and wildlife in the Delta, while it also embraces and balances human land use needs. And the outcome of that would be a healthy, thriving, sustainable ecosystem capable of supporting the Delta's many competing uses. And we really feel that's the vision that's laid forward in the Reform Act, and it's the one that we carry into the ecosystem amendment to address the requirements of the Act. I won't review the specific components of the vision. We discussed these in some detail in April. In April, staff recommended essentially retaining the existing description of the vision for the Delta ecosystem that was in Chapter 4 of the Delta Plan as it was adopted in 2013. Feedback from council members on that material was positive, and the preliminary draft narrative now reflects the existing Chapter 4 vision with the addition of a conceptual illustration, which was this previous slide here that shows sort of the balance between agricultural lands and restored ecosystem components. The updated vision also includes a case study. And that case study is of the Cosumnes River Preserve. This is essentially a 50,000 acre combination of wildlife habitat and ag land that's owned by 7 different partners. So you can kind of see how it brings in each of these components that we need for effective ecosystem restoration. A large project, a combination of habitat and other uses, and partnership among multiple parties. So in many ways, we feel the Cosumnes River Preserve is representative of the type, the scale, and the actions that are needed, as well as the collaboration needed to achieve ecosystem restoration in the Delta. And again, that's a roughly 50,000 acre project. And again, just to remind, we're talking about a target potentially in the performance measures of something between 60 and 80,000 acres. So I think just that also provides a good sense of the scale of project that would be required. So in a moment, we'll pass this back to the rest of the team to continue to focus on the connections between the threats and stressors, the policies and recommendations, and the performance measures, and ultimately then the outcomes of our efforts. And again, in summary, the narrative is a really key part of this package that ties those pieces of information together, from the best available science to the vision, to the policies and recommendations, to the performance measures, and ultimately to the key outcomes, which would be illustrated by those performance measures, which include the restoration targets. Okay, I'll now hand off to Jessica, who's going to help us connect those issues and stressors to our policy approach and performance measures.
Good morning, council members. So we have 5 core strategies to go through. I'd invite you, you're welcome to pause and ask. I'll pause after each strategy if you have questions. We have a lot more information to go through, including revisions to the policies and the recommendations. Since the April meeting, there's a lot of detail in the discussion about the policies and recommendations, and then we have a whole block of new information on the performance measures. So I'm happy to go through this in as much detail as you want, but I do want to make sure that we're reserving enough time to go through the next sort of 2 levels of information. So Jeff did a really great job describing sort of all the threats and all the stressors and really the depth and the breadth of the issues that we're trying to get at with these core strategies. And from the beginning, if you remember, even I think it was about a year ago when we started to think and try and organize how we were going to approach the core strategies in this document, we really broke it down into 2 pieces. One was sort of the physical aspects of restoration, which is where we're bringing in those physical impacts, those threats to the ecosystem. And then also the softer and in some ways the more difficult side, which is the implementation, the human aspect, right? How we work as organizations and institutions to not just create a system that sort of a planning system or a design system that will get us the type of restoration projects that we want, but how do you actually get those on the ground? What kind of partnerships do you need? What kind of funding do you need? Who needs to be at the table? What kind of conversations do you need to have, and what kind of barriers do you need to remove? So the core strategies are still following that blueprint, which is really looking at the physical aspects of restoration and then looking at the institutional and implementation side of things. So let me walk through them one by one. I'm going to note where we've made a few changes. The narrative, of course, we're really happy to have the narrative out. We've been thinking and writing. The version that you have, I think at one point the version that we had was about 85 pages. So we really kind of tried to distill it down and really boil it down. The narrative itself, I encourage everyone to read it and to go through. It's a pretty tight discussion that gives a little bit of background, really identifies the problem statement, some context, examples where they're important, and then really lays out that strategy and how that strategy connects to the policies and recommendations. So just going through, let's just start with preliminary core strategy 1, create more natural functional flows. So functional flows must work in tandem with non-flow restoration actions in order to be effective. And that effectiveness is all about being able to restore function through reestablishing land-water connection. Obviously, this has been a theme, not just here. This is a big theme at the State Water Board right now and all the discussions that they're having on the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. This section and this core strategy defines functional flows using best available science, and then identifies the role of the State Water Resources Control Board in setting those flow objectives, which is the process they're engaged in right now, and explains the requirements for covered actions to meet those flow objectives. One note in response to both council member input and stakeholder input, this section also now summarizes the voluntary agreements process and the potential for new flow objectives to be set through that process. If flow objectives are set through voluntary agreements, then the flow component of those VAs would be used as new flow objectives for ERP1. And we can get into the policy details a little bit more. I think Avery will be able to there's some additions there that we can talk about. And then any restoration projects, if any, under the voluntary agreements would be treated as covered actions. So if there are any questions, I can pause there, or any clarifications.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I want to take us back a level, because before we get into a lot of these specifics, some of the stuff that Jeff covered addressed my concerns, but I want to be more specific. I want to go back to something I've said before is the ecosystem restoration chapter should be setting out, if this happens, we achieve the co-equal goal of ecosystem restoration. And I want to, because the Reform Act, as you said, Jeff, is the single most important driver of what our vision, I want to look at the Reform Act and in my, the first two questions, it seemed like that C5, what you put up there, conditions conducive to meeting or exceeding the goals in existing species recovery plans and state and federal goals with respect to doubling salmon population. So you've got the recovery plans and you have the salmon doubling goals. That leads us to a certain number and type of acreage to achieve that. So we have another section in the Delta Reform Act that says the Delta Plan shall include measures that promote all of the following characteristics of a healthy Delta ecosystem. And this is the 1 through 4 viable populations, functional corridors, diverse and biologically appropriate habitats, an ecosystem, and reduce threats and stresses on the Delta system. So if we're designing around or recommending in the plan around sort of the C5 provision in the Act, if we do that, do we meet, C1 through 4? So that's clearly, if the filter I'm trying to suggest we have is we need to be able to say, you do this and you've achieved ecosystem restoration. And by the way, this helps on water supply reliability. But, it's kind of, well, are we saying that? And then if this is the key driver, the recovery plans and the salmon doubling goal, if we just do that, are we automatically doing everything else?
Do you want to go ahead? Go ahead.
Appreciate the discussion around this, and I guess I would start with pointing out in the relevant legislation section, page 4.4, 85302E sets out sub-goals and strategies, which are in addition to the characteristics that we've described. And
That's page 4.4
Or
in the draft
in
narrative.
the draft narrative.
Of attachment 1.
So I think as Ms. Pearson has pointed out in her introduction to prior meetings and this meeting, the Reform Act really gives us extensive guidance to build from in terms of defining success. And so some of the terms are restore large areas of interconnected habitats, establish migratory corridors for fish, birds, and other animals, promote self-sustaining diverse populations of native and valued species by reducing risk, and it goes on. So we have a lot to work from in terms of defining success. I think one other important thing to touch on is there are a couple of standards that are embedded in the Reform Act. One is the standard of recovery. And if we look at the definition of recovery in the federal language, it really speaks to halting declines. In some cases where recovery plans have been developed, there are target population sizes and numbers of populations identified. In other cases, there are acreages identified that are intended to halt decline. And at that point, a species is considered recovered. Self-sustaining diverse populations as in 85302E3, self-sustaining is a different level of standard. And again, if we look to things like the salmon doubling goal, self-sustaining is discussed and defined. And really, the intention here is that a species is able to maintain healthy populations without human intervention. So there are a couple levels for us to look at in terms of again, defining that success. And then I guess the last point that I would make is that we've tried to summarize the existing information under each of those standards. And so our analysis has not been limited to recovery plans only, nor the salmon doubling goal only, which really speaks to a self-sustaining population, not just a recovered population. But we've also incorporated conservation plans, which aren't associated necessarily with an Endangered Species Act requirement to develop a recovery strategy to halt decline. And these really are focused on establishing conditions on the landscape that support self-sustaining. I think our limitation, admittedly, is we don't have each of those standards defined for every species on the landscape. And so the information that's out there, we've captured, I think we've synthesized, we've broken down to address the Delta landscape itself. And that's really what we've brought to bear in both the discussion of restoration targets and the strategies and actions that we've identified, and some of the planning work that's been done to support project proponents out there on the landscape with data and tools. The last, I guess I would touch on the question around, if we meet the recovery goals, do we then achieve viable populations and functional corridors? I think the way to frame the question is more, if we do 2, 3, and 5, so functional corridors for migratory species, 3 is diverse and biologically appropriate habitats, and 4, we reduce threats and stressors, then we actually beget 5, recovery of species. And based on the information that we've summarized, meeting objectives, we may well reach self-sustaining populations as well. And so today, I think the amendment content and the various components that we're laying out are really based on those various standards and the existing, limited by the existing information, but we've really tried to rely on the science that's out there in defining that goalpost.
So then and I'm kind of thinking, and maybe hold this thought for the narrative discussion, but it's how we describe the process at which we get to achieving the co-equal goal, but it's also we get to a total number of acres that are designed a certain way to do certain things. So it sounds like all of these things are connected, but if you meet the sustainability standard, that's a higher standard that subsumes all the other standards, but also requires these same, land-water connections and those types of things. So I'm just looking at, as a council member, when we approve the plan, we're approving the vision, but we're also saying, hey, you've got to have this number of acres. We should describe this process, because there's maybe, we say, well, the Reform Act drives it, but it drives it in many different directions, and we're just we're taking that and saying, okay, and I think, Ron, what I'm hearing is we didn't apply, and I don't want to, drive down to the weeds, but I think this is important. We're not applying sustainability standards to everything, but we're trying to come up with the best ecosystem that gets us closer to that standard, and sometimes maybe we don't get there. It's just, that seems to be at the heart of.
Based on existing scientific
Right, right.
information, right? That's the limitation.
Yes. Yeah, and you used everything that's out there, but, I think that's where I'm trying to understand is how do we explain this? What's the standard? It's not quite formulaic. I mean, there's some subjective, but when if we put 60 to 80,000 acres out there, okay, the next question is how are we going to do it? How much does it cost? And we'll talk about that. But I think it's kind of doing our due diligence on how you got to that acreage number and making sure we're communicating, hey, if we're going to achieve this, because we're saying this plan amendment tells us how we're getting to the co-equal goal. So that needs to be talked about in the narrative. And maybe I'm not picking it up, or it needs to be a separate discussion on how we got there. What are we looking at? And it's all of these factors.
So, Councilmember Weinberg, I think you're, I really like where you're going with this, because I think you're picking up on an aspect of a thread in the that's in the narrative, and how we've been sort of this conversation about, is the result of this amendment going to be just sort of status quo? Or are we getting to a level of ecosystem restoration where we're going beyond, sort of one or two steps beyond what's required right now for mitigation of water projects and other development? Or are we really going beyond that and getting to a restored ecosystem? And so in the narrative, the narrative is following that conversation, which is no, in order to achieve the Delta Reform Act, you really need to go beyond sort of status quo mitigation and really get to a restored system. And so that's where the strategies are laying out, here's what function looks like, here's how you do it. I think what you're picking up on and what I hear, and I think it's a really valuable perspective on it, is from the Delta Reform Act, the recovery plans and the salmon doubling goal are doing that same sort of stepwise process, which is there's recovery and then there's self-sustaining populations. And we're going for self-sustaining and sort of full ecosystem function.
Because even, and maybe I have just enough knowledge to be dangerous, but recovery plan standards are different. I mean, it's a higher level than, typically what you do in mitigation, which is kind of what I'm, where I come from. So to me, okay, recovery plans, that's like a big deal. We're talking about this sustainability, and like Ron said, non-human intervention, which means, I don't know what that means. I mean, does that mean no management of the habitat, or with management of the habitat? These are kind of the arcane issues that, need to get dealt with in implementation. But that's kind of where I'm going. So, thank you.
I have one. On the page 17 of, no, I think it's the 16, wait, no, I'm sorry, 20. The slides. 20 of the slides where you talk about the core strategies, and number 5 is to improve institutional coordination to support the implementation of ecosystem protection, restoration, and enhancement. I'm wondering if there's a chapter or is a space in the narrative or division where it talks about the challenges that in the real world, when it leaves us and when we leave this room and this vision and plan leaves us and goes in the real world, the challenges that it faces, including legislative challenges, legal challenges, permitting challenges, the interest of private sector, the interest of, because the institutions are some of the stakeholders, but then there is this other obstacles and challenges that might really hinder or stop any of this from becoming reality. And if there is a place anywhere in our discussion or in the narrative or that highlights all that, and highlights in a way that okay, we have this great vision and we have this narrative, and now we put this out in what is the reality of the world where we live in, and who's gonna say yes and no, and what are the built-in mechanisms that are going to hinder this because there's a private sector interest that pushes something which is totally against this. And then there is legislative lack of legislation helping this. And then there is certain kind of permitting, yes or no. Sometimes permitting is for us, sometimes it might be against. And all these other factors. And if there would be a summary of these points that are challenges.
So it's a really good question. I've flipped to the side that, and I can talk about the triangle diagram in a second, but that section, the core strategy, it does identify a few barriers that we know about, that permitting, funding barriers, long-term operations and maintenance, we know there's some very specific barriers. I think what it does also is lacking sort of a perfect conceptual model of knowing where all the projects get stopped. I mean, I think what you're describing, a lot of people who have been practicing restoration have sort of in their heads and intuitively know this is where projects get hung up. Sort of absent that perfect conceptual model and diagram of what those are, what we've really put in place is a process using DPIC, the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, to develop a subgroup of folks from state agencies, federal agencies, local agencies that do the restoration work on a regular basis and sort of live and breathe what those barriers are. And that group, we've actually already started meeting just a subset of the state agencies, and that group is really charged with coming up with a set of priority barriers that that we know stop projects or that we know create issues in timing or funding, and to really identify what those barriers are, the priorities, and then pitch some solutions to the DPIC committee on how we can get past those in a more efficient and effective way. And I think one of the sort of the most important pieces of that is really the need for constant and really dedicated and thoughtful coordination between the council and the state and the federal and local agencies that are working in the Delta on restoration projects. And I think that example from Cosumnes of, this is a 50,000 acre restoration project. It's also a park. It's beautiful, and it has sort of this long history of partners that are coming together that include nonprofits and state and federal agencies, and that when we see models of really successful restoration, it's that coming together over the course of years with partners who are working through the difficulties on a regular basis. And so that sort of, that DPIC subgroup is the group that we're hoping can help come together and create some synergy around solving the larger restoration barriers.
So thank you for the explanation. So just because I'm used to a blueprint that is thought conceptually, then blueprint, then, detail, and then implementation. If you would say that after you develop this great blueprint and conceptual plan, you would give this to who to implement it? So that when we all go home, we make sure that this great ideas are in safe hands of somebody to implement. You would say it's a DPIC.
Right, yes. Yes, and that's where it's identified right
And
now. as a
those are the ones
recommendation.
who would fight for funding. And so would there be anything here that would say, from this to implementation, there is a space, and what happens there? Or is there in everything that we prepared?
There's discussion of funding, ownership, permitting, sort of what those barriers are. And that's where, and there are some policies and recommendations that are identifying specific ways in which coordination can continue. There are a lot of, and this diagram shows there are a lot of planning activities, sort of the world of restoration in the Delta is very broad. There's a lot that's going on. There's habitat conservation plans, there's recovery plans, conservation plans that have regulatory requirements that are outside of the influence of the council. And then there are these other restoration programs and plans that are non-regulatory, but are really intended to bring groups of people together around certain issues. And that's where, we are engaged in that work right now. We intend to continue to be engaged in that work.
And where would the legislative action go under the same?
Yep. So sort of the top of it for us is really Delta Reform Act that's really driving all of this, and our role in bringing agencies together and really coordinating their activities.
So would you think then that there's an ongoing legislative effort in putting this on the map on a continuous basis? And who would do, is the
Yeah.
PAC who would do that?
For us, following through and implementing the Delta Reform Act is really the perspective that we're coming from. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's actually just flip back, because that's a really great discussion about Core Strategy 5. Going back to Core Strategy 2, so this is really describing, based on best available science, a tremendous amount of research, work that was done. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to read the 3 synthesis papers that we put together. If you're familiar with the work of SFEI, the San Francisco Estuary Institute, there's just a tremendous amount of work that's been going into really understanding, identifying, and describing the principles and sort of priority attributes for doing restoration work. So, Councilmember Weinberg, I think this answers, part of your question, which is you have this plan, you have this target, you want to start implementing things. What does it look like? How do you do it? And so what we're really proposing are these principles and these attributes of what restoration should look like. Understanding that there's a full range and sort of a lot of different ways and menu of options to do restoration. So what we're laying out is this sort of very detailed analysis of tiers, different types of restoration. So tier 1 through 4, understanding that the landscape varies a lot, and that not all restoration is appropriate in all locations. So this is a new diagram that's included in the narrative that I think really illustrates one, sort of the complexity that a restoration designer faces when they're looking at the landscape. There's a lot of different elevations. This is broad. This is a landscape scale slice of what what a lot of the delta looks like. But even on an individual site, you've got a lot of variability. You've got upland, you've got downland, you've got riparian channels. There's a lot of variation from site to site. But this describes and illustrates restoration opportunities and sort of what different restoration types can look like on the landscape. Appendix 2 really describes that in great detail and provides a lot of guidance to project proponents and those who would come in with a covered action of what type of attributes that we would be looking for in a project, both sort of common attributes, which is the, sort of the basic aspects that we're looking for in a project, and then these really priority attributes that would help a project proponent identify how they're reaching and sort of meeting these individual tiers. Any questions on that? Go ahead.
Yes. No, thank you for that. So, the question I was having was that, and maybe, Ron kind of shed some light onto this, is that, one standard isn't applicable to everything.
Right.
So we're saying, gee, we really want a lot of this tier 1, tier 2 type of restoration. Are we saying, but it's not appropriate or feasible to do it or we don't really need it everywhere? There are certain areas where we need it, and and all of this affect, the typical problem that most people in the rest of the world, not kind of the expert world, is all this predation going on. And so when you look at this kind of design and where you're locating tier 1 and tier 2 restoration, are we getting at specific predation hotspots? Are we, is that one of the things we're doing? Is it, what are we doing with invasives? I mean, or it's like a tier 1, you've got all of these elements in it, and so we're addressing predation, we're addressing invasives, we're addressing the food web. I mean, I think that's kind of, maybe an understanding that, hey, we're just not saying do this and you meet, you recover a species. We're do this and you recover the species by addressing specific issues.
Right.
So if somebody says, hey, is that plan, you guys dealing with predation?
Yep.
And we can say, yeah, and here and how, this is how we're doing it, where and how.
So it's a good segue to core strategy 4, but yes, so what you're picking up on, so the issues of food web, predation, the approach that we're taking is that when you take a functional ecosystem approach, right, when you're reconnecting land and water, that those are the best strategies to address issues like predation and food web. There's research that came out recently that had actually the State of Bay Delta Science, which is the science program publication, there was an issue or one of the articles in there was talking about predation, and the result was saying the best management action to address things like predation hotspots is to really reconnect land and water and to do restoration. I think the other, and Ron, feel free to elaborate on this, but protecting native species is really dependent on our ability to provide two things. One, water, right, functional flows, and then also robust rearing habitat and space for fish to eat. And so the way you do that is really through reconnecting land and water. And you're welcome to elaborate on that.
And when you have a highly channelized system with
Right.
open water and no places to hide from predators, your competitive advantage as a native species is severely degraded. And so this allows native species to be more successful in competing with those predators or avoiding those predators or getting stronger than they would otherwise be to be less susceptible to those predators.
And maybe, and I don't want to kind of take too much time up on this, but maybe one way to look at the strategies is they're not in isolation. Because I brought my question up on one strategy and you went to another, and it's like, well, but they're complementary, they're supportive, all this stuff is connected and integrated, and you really can't be successful unless you follow through on all of this. And maybe that's a point we need to draw out. I mean, I think it's implied, but sometimes you've got to like, hey, this all supports each other.
Yes.
Yeah, and excuse me, but that was in my opening comments why I really wanted to highlight the natural functional flow component, which is core strategy 1, because there's been quite a bit of focus around that. But if you don't restore these acres, then restoring 40% of unimpaired flow is only going to get you so far in the ecosystem.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because when we get to the narrative, I think that's something we need to talk more about. That connection of, it's all of this, and by the way, it also improves water supply reliability, and it gets to the metrics. So that's why a lot of this is really, it's so connect the dots kind of thing that we need to make sure that's coming out in what we put out there. But just, one last question on this was, so we get all these things from Tier 1 and Tier 2 restoration sites, but we're also saying that you don't have to do, we can live with Tier 3 and 4 to some extent. Or we quantify that somewhere. It's like, okay, in our maps, are we saying, okay, well, in this area, because that seems to be the opportunity we miss with these Tier 3 and 4 and getting them to incorporate some Tier 1 and 2 attributes to make the system more robust. So that's a message we need to be clear on. Is it okay in a limited fashion? Is it okay? Or if we don't get the amount of Tier 1s and 2s, then this whole thing isn't going to work.
So you are on the right track with that, which is we are very much encouraging Tier 1 and Tier 2 projects. They do not work in every location. And so there are priority habitat areas that are identified in the plan. And one of the policies is that restoration projects need to be done at the right elevation. And a lot of that information is included in Appendix 2. But there's also a lot of land in the Delta that, the primary land use in the Delta will remain in agriculture. And there's a tremendous amount of benefit that, speaks directly to the co-equal goals. There are things that can be done to make working lands more productive for species and habitat that won't be done everywhere. There's also a lot of area in the Delta that's very highly subsided, which, to do this again, is almost a little bit fun, right? So core strategy, protecting against and safeguarding against land loss. There's a lot of areas that are deeply subsided, and there are really good restoration and management actions that can be taken to help reduce that subsidence. That's not necessarily providing tier 1 and tier 2 habitat, because you're not reconnecting land and water and creating native communities in the way that you would be doing in other areas, but they're still really viable projects and really important to the restoration of the ecosystem overall. So very much the strategy and the approach that we're proposing is that you're doing restoration in the right place at the right elevation based on what really works. And the targets, and I think when we talk about that performance measure, Ron can explain this a bit more in a bit more detail. The restoration targets that we're going after are really aimed at that tier 1 and tier 2 type projects. So
I kind of like the subheading of doing restoration in the right places at the right levels.
Yep.
I mean, that's an important point, because
Yep.
land use conflicts are something we have to deal with.
Okay. So I think I've gone through all the core strategies at this point. If there are any other questions I'm just about sort of individual aspects of it, I think we can get into that in the policies and recommendations. And then in the performance measures obviously link back to the core strategies and the policies and recommendations overall.
I have one question on your, you're not at the strategy, can I go to strategy 4? And
Yes.
ask a question?
Yeah, so I think we've, let's just go back for 1 second. So we've covered 1, I think we've discussed 2. We started to, and this is right strategy, right place, right location, looking at subsidence reversal opportunities and really safeguarding against land loss. The other aspect of this is really addressing climate change impacts. We know there's a tremendous amount of impacts that are coming down the road, and looking at climate change and sea level rise is a really important aspect to that.
I just had.
Was there ones?
Yeah, are you going to cover this now?
Yes.
And then, okay, my question's here. So
Okay.
I'll wait.
So we had talked a bit about this with the salmon doubling goal and the recovery plans, but I think the other aspect of this is that the narrative really describes ongoing efforts among public agencies and other stakeholders to identify and manage non-native invasive species, and we're recommending some approaches to improving fisheries management and explaining, it explains the expected outcomes that we would have from those management actions. If there were other questions, so we're happy to address them.
No, my questions was on this too, because last year when we took the Delta tour, well, of course, the whole idea of steelhead bass, and then when we get to the Clifton, Court, Forebay.
Right.
So I'm going back to my previous question of, after we know all this, who's gonna do anything? It's a year went by, and maybe my question is simplistic and short term. What was done there after we know all this? When I asked my first question about the implementation and the process and the challenges, this goes back to that pretty much of who is going to do specifics, like let's say like
Management actions.
removing fish passage barriers. It's a huge thing.
Right.
Or not introducing more non-native invasive species. That's where I'm taking my question. And I'm not expecting that we're going to resolve it here, but I'm trying to see if after we say and know and leave the room,
Right.
what happens? Who does it?
Do you want to, go ahead.
So it's a complicated landscape, lots of actors working, I think. And this touches on the pyramid graphic a little bit. The Delta Plan is meant to speak to a broad audience of agencies that are both implementing direct actions as, capital improvements to the system, but also, funding programs that either incentivize or provide the resources for project proponents outside of state agencies that are doing restoration and other activities on the landscape. So it's hard to sum up in one simple statement who, for fish passage, for an example, Department of Water Resources has been hard at work resolving barriers to migration in the Yolo bypass associated with the Calusa main drain. At the same time, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, through the Ecosystem Restoration Program, has funded fish screen work throughout the Central Valley, and that's being carried out by irrigation districts. So it's everything from sort of quasi-public, private entities accessing funding programs to direct state agency and federal agency work within the system. And I think the Delta Plan is really, our work is really trying to set out the considerations for all of those different aspects of how we work as a system.
We're going to monitor and score this, let's say for these two elements. What would we do? Where would you score it, monitor it? If you were monitoring the implementation and you would want to score.
So we have an existing performance measure on non-native invasive species, where we are tracking introductions of new species. Again, there's a broad community of actors. Our covered actions process is one way that we directly implement a policy related to project construction and requirements that, or consistency with the Delta Plan would beg that project proponents design and implement their projects in a way that prevents non-native species introductions, prevents the creation of habitat for those. In terms of fish management and fish passage, we are proposing a preliminary performance measure today that touches on those various aspects of the system that I talked about, the direct state actions that have been identified in several documents in terms of resolving fish migration challenges, and then some of the prioritization schemes that the Department of Fish and Wildlife has put in place to identify funding priorities for their funding programs. So skipping to that early, but.
And I think, this is a topic that obviously, so there's a Delta Plan policy related to it. It's a core strategy in this amendment. There's a lot of work that's going on. Our science program is engaged in work right now to do a review of, basically a synthesis review of actions that were taken to remove invasive species, and they're looking at how effective those actions have been from a very scientific perspective. And it's certainly on the list of topics that I think we should continue to bring back to the council, because there's so much that's going on in this area. It's one that's really important to the community. It's an important part of the core strategy, but I think it's also just an important part of the work and that we track as a council.
Ken?
Just follow up on Maria's question and maybe ask a slightly different one. It's specifically, does the plan address the Clifton Court 4-Bay hotspot? Or is if we do everything we say, how have we rectified that situation?
So it does, and I would imagine you would be a little unsatisfied with the way that it addresses it, but explicitly, I think it's page 435, improve fisheries management. We identify a set of priority migration corridors through the system. Clifton Court is not along.
Okay, so indirectly, do we think they're going to migrate a different path?
And we lay out a set of actions to implement along those corridors that include habitat restoration, reduction of fish passage barriers, so improving their migration efficiency and movement through the Delta. That definitely includes direct remediation of hotspots along those corridors.
So maybe that's a sidebar, because it's one of the things, I think, Maria, you've brought this up since we went on that tour, because it hits you so hard. And if we've got, if part of the grand strategy addresses something like that, and then I think, Maria, kind of where you were going is okay, who's going to do that? Is that become a DWR permit issue, is you've got to, change the landscape and.
The last item is direct sort of behavioral modification of the fish. And so we can put structures in place or techniques to keep fish on track.
Yeah.
The Delta cross channel is an example of where we open gates to allow water to flow, close gates, and part of those decisions are around keeping fish on track in their migratory corridor. There's also experimental work going on with things like bubble curtains and Georgiana slough and keeping fish out of predator hotspots. So we have a suite of tools, and I think we lay out the places where it is relevant to implement those. In terms of the implementer, again, I would just, we're trying to speak to, this is one of the challenges of this amendment, a broad audience that involves state and federal agencies, local actors, and
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to talk about it.
Yeah.
I mean, and bring it out, highlight it. I mean,
And see
maybe that's
if
part
we
of
ever
it.
can do anything
Yeah,
for
but
that. If
point
we have
out
any
that
role
it's-
we say improve institutional coordination and really or even legislative action or whatever. What is our role in if any? I don't know. Because we know a lot. Then what?
Randy?
A couple things regarding predation. I know that bass are often the primary predator identified. That falls under the authority of the Fish and Game Commission to do something about it, and they have been, they have not taken any action, even with public interest and urging. I think we addressed Clifton Court in the operations portion of the CSO amendment. I think there's some recommendations in there. But sadly, I think it was Dr. Peter Moyle recently that said the salmon in the San Joaquin system that have the best chance of survival are the ones that are captured at the pumps and then relocated to be released to the ocean. So the killing field of predation is a huge issue, and I think there are other agencies that have some responsibilities, and we have in the Chapter 3 offered some thoughts, and now we're offering additional thoughts.
So on the question of who for the various actions in our ecosystem amendment, it is really tough to say exactly who. And my experience through the years has been that when there is a hotspot or when there is a particular issue, it often depends on the immediacy of what it's affecting. So for example, in a drought year, if certain actions are affecting water supply, there's a certain group of agencies that gets involved. And often ad hoc teams are formed. So I like the idea that in this amendment, we bring out more readily and more immediately these hotspots and what agencies have been doing, and which agencies are likely to have a role, and more clearly cite our role among our sister agencies. And I'd also like to point out that so much depends on the issue being addressed, the project being proposed, and the funding sources. Sometimes when the issue is more immediate, somehow we find the will and the agencies and the money, and we put together that team. Other times, if there's not a crisis or a deadline, it's a plan like ours that points, like the Delta plan, that points to the trajectory that you want to get yourself tracked on. And then again, you look at the landscape of agencies and partners, nonprofit, private, et cetera, and you go after the projects that are on that trajectory. And so our tier 1, 2, 3, and 4, to me, communicates the kinds of projects that will get us on the trajectory described in the chapter. But there will never, and the performance measures also are indicators of whether or not we're staying on that trajectory. The one thing that I'd like everybody to keep in mind is there won't be a day when we achieved recovery. This is a highly managed system, dynamic, it'll always be changing. So we will have to be creative in our partnerships and keep our eye on that trajectory. But given climate change and the unknowns, our trajectory could change. And that's why we revisit this every 5 years. So I like the idea of bringing out the roles of the players and who has done what actions in the past and who's likely to do what actions in the future, and maybe even the, as Ken pointed out in his memo, the costs. And that'll give folks a sense of the magnitude of what we're trying to do here and the time frame.
Given the complexity that Susan just brought up, is there any value? I don't think there probably is, in light of what she said, and what you've already said, to cataloging who the responsive parties would be and how things would be implemented, or is it better to just simply follow through with what you're telling us? These are the goals, these are what we should be doing, and this is what we expect to happen. But catalog and implementation is just it's time consuming and probably not very productive in light of the fact things change dramatically, with sea change being the classic example of that. What's your thoughts on that?
There's quite a bit of that we can do that's stable enough to capture, and then there's some of that I think lends itself to the implementation forum, where things will change and actors will change and players will change.
In 2013, Phil and I visited Washington, D.C. to inform the Congress and federal agencies about the content of the Delta Plan. We took with us a summary of the 73 recommendations and 14 regulations and categorized those under the agencies that had responsibilities. So we've already done some of that. Some of the recommendations had one agency. Some of them had 10 listed. But we have a worksheet somewhere where we, in 2013, when we did that, I think it wouldn't be too hard to update that.
So this is actually a good segue to this discussion of the performance measures, because we have, in the Delta Plan, we have several types of performance measures. We have administrative performance measures, which does exactly what you're talking about, which is taking the taking the recommendations, identifying which agencies are responsible for carrying those out and tracking them. We have administrative performance measures dashboard on our website where you can go and click on an agency's logo and see which agencies are responsible. So for the performance measures, which are linked to the recommendations, we have a way of doing that. There is a lot of sort of shift and change in sort of the individual actions. There's some information right now on, the sort of myriad of agencies that are involved in, for example, in invasive species. There's a new interagency task force on that. But I think it's both. It's being able to track, but then also being able to be nimble and understand what task forces are coming up. DPIC also plays an important role in tracking those interagency initiatives. Just looking at the time, if it's okay, we were thinking maybe we could talk and shift to performance measures, which is sort of the newest block of information that we haven't presented to the council yet. And then, close out. We have more information about the policies and recommendations that we presented in April, but.
Well, Ken has one last question. We are a little off track, so I anticipate we'll go a little beyond noon. And after Ken's question, let's move on to the performance measures.
No, thank you. And I realize we're trying to cover some amount, but I think it's important that we have this discussion and understand what are we doing, what are we saying. I just wanted to build off this previous discussion, but look at it from the perspective of the plan, the predation, dealing with predation hotspots. What we're recommending does not specifically address this, but we talked about the standards. So when you talk to people in the Delta science community, salmon seems to be top of mind for them. So are we what we're recommending, does that say, hey, this assumes you're going to reduce that problem, or we're going to make salmon, the distribution and abundance of salmon in other parts of the Delta self-sustaining? What are we saying is the path to either recovery or sustainability for salmon if we don't specifically address kind of where the major problems are? What's your vision for salmon recovery? And I haven't read the recovery plans. I don't know anything, but we have to communicate that to the public and the policymakers. How does the plan doing that?
So I think our path forward on this predation issue, again, is to identify a subset of the Delta and to focus our efforts and the suite of tools that we have on those areas of the Delta. Predation is a complicated issue. We're not going to be able to directly manage the non-native invasive species. It's really difficult to use our fish and game programs to do that, especially because of environmental justice issues. You have, top trophic level organisms that have accumulated a lot of mercury. Changing bag limits puts the Fish and Game Commission and Department of Fish and Wildlife in the position of seeing that mercury wind up on the dinner plates of society and some of the more disadvantaged components of society. So there's some real challenges in, given the size and the complexity of the Delta, it's really difficult to implement direct management of fish species. In a lake that's closed, like Lake Davis, pike, they poison the lake, they remove the fish, they restore the natives. It's feasible in that setup. The Delta is such an open system, it's really not a path forward. And so we're really left with kind of prioritizing areas in the Delta and then bringing the tools of restoration and migration efficiency to the table. And that's what the chapter is recommending.
So you don't have to, and I think this is important, you don't have to solve every predation hotspot in order to get the salmon to a recovery or sustainability level. I mean, is that kind of
That's right.
inherent in our plan?
This is a little bit anecdotal, and I guess I would hope that at some point we could have some of the fish experts come in and talk a little bit about this issue. But if we look at the San Joaquin River and what's happening this year with some of the spring run fish that were released upstream in the upper San Joaquin, they've been able to outmigrate, grow over the past 4 years, and I'm told there are 100 or more fish in the river at this point. I believe we've caught and looked at the tags on 23 individuals, but salmon are a resilient species, and their life history is such that they create 4,000 eggs per female. 10 of those eggs come back. That's a huge increase in the population size across the landscape. And so they're really set up or well positioned to respond if we put the pieces in place that Jessica talked about earlier, the habitat they need for rearing, the functional flows they need to make it through the system, and not get bogged down with water quality issues and other impediments to migration. So, yes. Short answer, yes.
No, that was great, because I think that's something, I keep thinking in the plan, what are the key things we want to get across? And maybe that's an example we use because everybody is focused on salmon. Unfortunately, not as much on Delta smelt, but salmon seems to be, top of mind. And we should explain how our plan results in the recovery of salmon, and also say, hey, we should solve all these predation hotspots, but that's more difficult. We can work towards that, but we can do things in the landscape that, brings the salmon to a sustainable level or recovery level. And I don't know if it's all of the runs, the spring run and the winter run, or it's specific to, the San Joaquin. That's the stuff, but, it's important. What are we saying we're doing about the salmon? Because it kind of gets lost in all the other species, but we know people are tuned in on that. And we should describe how we've painted the picture for success. So thank you for bearing with me.
Ken, I come from a region that has conducted a lot of studies on the tributaries and determined that 96% of the out-migrating salmon never make it to the ocean. Predation has, for years, has been identified as the key problem, and it's right to address that. But my thinking has evolved over time, and at the last Delta Science Conference, you couldn't attend the discussions, the poster boards, and leave without concluding that the salmon are starving in the Delta because of the lack of this land-water connection that Jessica and Jeff and Jessica have all talked about. Cliff Dahm, when he was here, said, with the channelized system we have, you can double the amount of water down the channel. It's not going to improve habitat. It's not going to improve the food web, so spreading that water out. So I've become a believer in the need to create floodplain habitat for rearing, for healthier salmon. YOLO bypass work indicates that there is the potential for success. And I think what Ron and others are telling us is our staff believes that that's the key ingredient. And that if we suppress bass, Mississippi silverside will arise. Or maybe white catfish are already the biggest problem, and they don't get any credit for all the salmon they eat. So I think the takeaway from what I've read through all of this is that we need to improve habitat, we need to improve the food web, we need to produce stronger salmon that can be more resilient through the passage and predation problems that they have. And whatever we can do to improve the narrative to nail that, I think is good. But that's the takeaway that I've
You just gave the justification for, if we get questions, well, what are you doing about predation? How can you recover salmon without dealing with it? You've just answered that question. And that's sort of the stuff we should make sure rises to the top. That's the foundation for what our vision is. And, we could solve the problems, but, in a perfect world, we'd get rid of all this, but we can also restore the species and the ecosystem without solving every probably insolvable problem. So I think we're all in total agreement. We're on the right path.
Working from that and from the understanding that all of these things are connected, we might jump, and I'll hand this over to Ron quickly, we might jump to the performance measure, which is talking about acreage targets, because I think that'll help really inform this discussion. And with that, I'll pass it over.
Sure. So one caveat that I want to share on the performance measures is that this has been the last part of the body of work to come together. These are preliminary. We have gone through internal peer review. Some, maybe almost all of the comments have been incorporated. I think we're stepping through a lead scientist review and have an external expert review lined up. And so help us make these better and read these as preliminary. The other point I'll make is that they're really intended to work together as a package. They touch on all of the things that we've talked about together today, the flows, the land water connections, this PM is really aimed at the natural vegetation communities that would populate the landscape where land and water are connected or in the upland areas of the Delta. We haven't gotten to it in any depth yet, but in light of climate change and other stressors out there, the fish migration improvement PM is really aimed at restoring connectivity in a large watershed. And so any single PM is not as strong as thinking across them and considering them as working together and how we understand how the system is being uplifted. In terms of PM 416, this is the acres of natural communities restored. We link it on the slide to Core Strategy 2. Again, this really also has linkages to Core Strategy 1 in respect to flows interacting with vegetation communities. Core Strategy 3 in terms of the parts of the landscape that are restorable and so on. Core Strategy 4. So again, I think understanding the extent that we are putting native natural communities back on the landscape really helps us understand our progress in achieving all of the strategies. So the metric here is acres. We get a function of those acres through the previous PM that talks about the connectivity with the river systems and also the frequency in which they inundate. This is really intended to both put out some planning guidance on what we should be targeting in terms of the level of land cover change on the landscape, and then also, of course, as a performance measure to help us understand our progress in meeting that. I've rolled up the PM in the chapter. You'll see there's more detailed accounting underneath of each of the different vegetation communities. So riparian corresponds with willow scrub and riparian forest. The wetlands are both tidal wetlands and seasonal wetlands. There's also treatment of grasslands and oak woodlands, so various vegetation communities. These are rolled up on this slide to riparian and wetland ecosystems, tidal wetland ecosystems, and then those latter upland ecosystems which reside above the floodplain and tidal inundation regimes. Riparian and wetland ecosystem targets, so we've taken a look across multiple data sources. I'll skip to the next slide in a minute and demonstrate where we've landed in terms of those different data sources. But really 19,000 to 35,000 acres is the target that the PM has identified as, and that's really intended to be the riverine environments on the Delta landscape. The range, as I'll demonstrate in a couple of slides in a minute, corresponds with the fact that you can establish riparian communities within the floodplain. You can also do that outside of the floodplain. If we choose to pursue projects that establish riparian outside of the floodplain, then we really we're not being as efficient as we could, and we start to tend towards the 35,000 acres. That'll make more sense in a minute with the slides. Tidal wetland ecosystems, the target is 32,500 acres. And then again, those upland ecosystems, oaks, grasslands, the vernal pools, and the salt pan ecosystems, sum to 14,528 acres. So honing in on really the connected natural community types, there's a lot of interest around how we arrived at at that target. And I can see that the slide in reformatting, our proposed target is actually 10,000 acres higher than it should be. So that black dotted line in the slide should be down at the top of the shorter bars. Essentially, we looked across 4 main data sets. One, the work of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan in scoping tidal marsh habitat improvements and reconnection to the river systems. And the tidal marsh component was 65,000 acres, and then I think there were several thousand acres of riparian systems acreage that were associated as well. As part of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan process, there was an analysis that took the salmon doubling goal and looked at the space use of salmon that were rearing in the system and survival as they moved through the system. This came out of the shop that I worked in at the time. It arrived at an acreage of about 51,000 acres of rearing habitat needed between the Sacramento and the San Joaquin valleys within the Delta boundaries. The third data set that we looked at was the Central Valley Joint Ventures Implementation Plan update. This is primarily an effort that looked at the space needed by bird communities for the suite of birds that are native to the Delta landscape to exist and have self-sustaining native populations. It actually used field-gathered data on densities of existing birds and projected the increases needed to achieve sustainable populations based on genetic work. While at DWR, I was also involved in the data collection within the Delta and providing the baseline there. And so this target is really built upon some very empirical work, and it's upwards of 80,000 acres to meet that sustainable need for birds in the system in terms of that non-human intervention existence. The last is the recovery and conservation plans that span a whole suite of different agency works. The State Wildlife Action Plan by DFW. There's several U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recovery plans, which really are targeting that legal definition of recovery that we talked about before. The Sassoon Marsh Restoration and Management Plan, and then the resiliency strategies for the smelt and the salmon. And when we look across those plans and the various needs of the species, we land on a target that's really similar to the salmon doubling goal, just about 1,000 acres below at 50,000 acres. And so we're really looking across these 4 data sets, and we selected sort of the lowest common denominator being both the salmon doubling goal and the recovery and conservation plans in identifying the combined targets of, if we could implement projects perfectly, it would be 19,000 acres of riparian and wetland ecosystems, that's tier 1 projects, and 32,500 acres of tidal wetland ecosystems. That gets you right in that 51,000 acres. So just real quick, we can look, this is Natomas levee improvement program. Yellow lines indicate the levees and the floodplain within the levees. The vegetation planning that has been done as a mitigation for this project exists outside the floodplain. And so we're not seeing floodplain. Let's see, we're not seeing us achieving our floodplain target and our riparian vegetation target within the same footprint, where the next slide indicates a location where that's happening. This is Dos Rios Farms down on the San Joaquin River, Dos Rios Ranch Preserve, actually, and it's a restoration project which is being implemented as we speak. And as you can see, the levees in yellow again, and the floodplain and riparian plantings, which will go in those clean parts of the landscape, are all in the same footprint. And so that's a really efficient way of achieving both floodplain and riparian objectives.
Ron, I should point out that most of the winter, that entire area from yellow to yellow was completely inundated with water. Yeah.
So. And then last, this is just an aerial of the work that's gone on the dry side of the levees here. This is Dutch Slough. We're opposite of the waterway. And again, another project that's incorporating both tidal marsh and the vegetation community all in the same footprint. So I'll pause there for questions. And again, apologies for the that black dotted line should be down right at the top of the bars, the second and fourth bar.
Just quickly, Ron, I mean, that sort of was what I was trying to get at, and you answered it really well. I think something we should discuss. How did we get to our acreage number? And we were focused on efficiency, which means that, yeah, we do have cost in the back of our mind. And, if you pick, it's sort of, if there's criticism out there of the efficacy of the salmon doubling goal, it's like, well, there's a potential to get there, and the incremental additional acreage is not that significant. And there's a response to a question. I mean, that's kind of how I look at this, is that we know the questions we're going to get. Do we put it in the plan to be able to respond to it? And that was just a great explanation. I mean, that really told us everything that you went through. We should read that in the plan.
I agree. It gets back to the right projects in the right places and kind of more benefit for the buck.
Should we do fish passage or?
Well, let's do a time check
Time check.
here. 11:53. Not that I want to force you to do fish passage in 7 minutes. No? Okay. Yes? Go
Just,
for it.
should we step through? So if I
Yeah.
step back to, let's see here. Increased funding for restoring ecosystem function. This PM ties back to both the project design criteria that Appendix 2 describe, and it allows us to track through our covered actions process how projects are being shaped in light of our guidance. The other aspect of this links to Core Strategy 5, and that's support for restoration implementation. And we're proposing to look at the amount of funding across the restoration universe and what component of that funding is being allocated to these high-quality restoration projects. So I think this is a data collection exercise that we can learn from in terms of how funding's being prioritized and how we are developing our projects. And we have a draft target of ambitious 80% of funding is being spent efficiently on these high-value projects. PM 415, seasonal inundation. This really talks about the land-water connections. It links back to Core Strategy 2. Again, connections with Core Strategy 1 and 3 and 4 as well. This PM is broken up into two metrics. One that really tries to understand the part of the landscape that is connected to the river systems, more of a static look at the system. And then the second part of the metric is understanding how frequently those areas are getting wet. So more of a dynamic look at whether or not we're achieving the outcomes that we want within the lands that we have set aside and connected to the river systems. The targets from this come directly out of the natural communities floodplain, and tidal marsh, which are based on the series of data points that we reviewed, the salmon doubling goal and the recovery plans. And so this has a strong linkage with the natural communities PM. And then protect land for restoration and safeguard against land loss. This is really trying to help us understand the implementation of subsidence reversal with an outcome of the potential to reconnect those lands to tidal function. And it really does two things. One, provides us an understanding of the areas of the system that are of an elevation that could catch up with sea level rise, and we could potentially restore into the future if we do subsidence reversal in the near term. And then two, it sets up a target, 3,500 acres in the legal delta and 3,000 acres in the Sassoon Marsh. If we were to implement subsidence reversal within those targets, we would offset the loss that we anticipate from sea level rise by 2,100 in terms of restoration potential. So this, again, strong linkage to core strategy 3 and protecting our ability to restore tidal, that land water connection. And then the last is PM 413, restore and enhance fish habitat connectivity. This is linked to core strategy 4 and fisheries management. There's a wonderful paper which, with all the papers that we read over the past several years, I'm not sure how it escaped me, but Herbold and et al., so Bruce and others, Renee Henry, last year published a paper on salmon, and they really walked out the importance of having a spatially diverse and genetically diverse salmon population in light of climate change. And part of that, achieving that outcome, are the things that we talked about, considerations of functional flows, and then also considerations of rearing habitat. The third portion is really connectivity to a greater extent of their spawning habitat. And there's been a bunch of work done by agencies in this realm. We kind of stepped through the various actors, both state agencies, addressing things within their authority down on the river systems. This identifies a set of rim dams or large dams that block passage to spawning habitats in higher elevation that would be resilient to climate change, and then also the barriers within the system and points of diversion, which may create issues for young salmon that are passing. We're excited to get feedback on this target, given sort of the expert opinions that have been involved and the filter of what's feasible to do, and then also what's biologically important to resolve. And so this, again, just summarizing, sets up a series of objectives in remediating passage barriers throughout the system, both in the delta, within the river systems, and then those barriers that are blocking access to habitat, which will be critical moving towards 2100 as our climate warms. That is the last new PM. So we kind of skipped the intro. Just to summarize, administrative performance measures, there's 18 new, 7 modified, 10 removed, and 10 unchanged. These link directly to the recommendations in the policy and recommendation framework. So we're not going to review those today. And then we reviewed the new performance measures. We also have 6 unchanged deal with functional flows, non-native species, and the salmon doubling goal.
Great, thank you, Ron. I think Jeff was motioning for the
Slide.
control.
I think, based on where we're at in the time, if we want to entertain questions about those other performance measures, we can. If there's no discussion, I would recommend we talk about next steps. I think that what Ron was talking about in terms of being excited about getting feedback, I think as staff, we're anxious to hear from the council to see if you agree that this package is ready to take some of the changes that we've heard here today, especially related to the narrative and others, prepare a public review draft that we can then put out, hopefully within a month's time, and start a broader discussion about whether this is complete, whether we're on target, off target, whether things are missing, whether things need to be described differently, whether our targets are off, and then bring all of that information and feedback and comment letters back to the council to have additional robust discussion about how to incorporate changes to a draft to your liking before we begin the CEQA process.
Okay. Before we do that, we do have one public comment. Deirdre Desjardins. By the way, I really like your surname, Desjardins. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we prepared to.
Yeah, thank you. Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. There's some new paper that came out of UC Davis on primary productivity in the Delta is suppressed by 97%. And they hypothesize that there's this is causing a trophic cascade, and it's responsible for things like the extinction of the Delta smelt, or near extinction. And it's because primary productivity is suppressed, zooplankton is suppressed because zooplankton is suppressed, small forage fishes like smelt are suppressed, and all the way up the food web. Striped bass populations are down enormously, and that isn't brought out in these predator discussions. All of the pelagic fishes are impacted. There's two causes. One in the paper. One is the invasion of Potamcorbula clams, and the other is they found that the export pumps are exporting plankton because of the timing. And there was a big shift. The 95 water quality plan, they removed restrictions on pumping in the summer, which were to protect striped bass spawning. And there was a big shift of basically holding back water in the reservoirs in the spring, and then releasing a lot of it in the summer when they can export 65% of the Delta inflow under D1641. And basically this means there's low residence time in the Delta, and in times in the summer and fall, you're replacing the phytoplankton-rich water with cold blue water from the Sacramento reservoirs, which doesn't have nutrients. So it's a combination of the two. And it's important in looking at this functional flow to take into account impacts on the benthic communities, because you can affect Potamcorbula, but it takes sustained freshening, probably over multiple years, to suppress it. There was a big explosion in Potamcorbula during the drought, and I think that's partly responsible. So this is important new research about the food web. And the other side of it is microcystis, to the extent the composition of the phytoplankton that's left is microcystis. It's much less nutritious, and it causes liver lesions in fish and can kill them. And Peggy Lehman did testing, and the column in the San Joaquin River times is pure microcystis. So there is, and flows can help break up microcystis blooms. There's a huge issue with temperature increases as well. But I think it's important that this science be taken into account in the functional flow recommendations. The one other thing is there's a long overlooked component. Decision 1641 required a fisheries protection plan for use of the joint point of diversion, and it has not been updated since 2006. It's supposed to be approved by Fish and Wildlife and the federal fish agencies and submitted to the Water Board. And this is a really important component for adaptive management because the water quality plan updates, as we've seen, take a decade or more, and we're not able to respond quickly enough. The Water Board's regulatory process, otherwise, isn't able to incorporate new information or changes. And, arguably, the smelt near extinction of the smelt is arguing for, actions right away because we may lose the species before the new flow recommendations are implemented. So I would like to see if they're going to review and assess it, it's built in. If the board just requires this fishery protection plan. The Bay Institute went back 10 years ago. They were trying to get the board to update that fishery protection plan annually. It would be a perfect way to bring adaptive management more into this effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. So to answer Jessica's question, council members, Ken, and then Austin.
I'm sorry I had to leave the room, but I had a couple of general questions for Ron on metrics, just to close this out if we're trying to get this information out for public review, and maybe this is something we need to incorporate into the text. But Ron, for restoration projects, there's usually success criteria associated with them. So how, what's our relationship? And this gets to implementation. So somebody other than us is going to implement the project, and they're going to have success criteria that somebody else other than us is going to impose on them. So, are we sort of thinking along the same lines or maybe there doesn't have to be a linkage to that?
There's not currently a linkage to that. I think we're operating at a higher level in really pointing at key features, but not currently looking at, on the ground evaluation of how maybe hydrology is working at the site or vegetation success.
Do we want to influence future success criteria?
I would say that those issues are best treated through our adaptive management instrument and the policy under GP1.
Okay.
In our covered actions process, which requires the project proponent to develop an adaptive management plan to identify these issues and then respond to them.
Those success criteria is going to impact our performance measures, I think. The success of the restoration is going to either help us or not help us. Usually there's a management plan requirement on these kind of sites? Are we going to be able, to be a party that gets that management plan, has input into that management plan? Or, are we going to sort of try and monitor this, or are we just going to look at the PMs and?
Again, I guess I would just go back to reliance on our covered actions process and setting up a framework, and then the recommendations and activities that we've described. An example of that is the IAMIT, the Interagency Adaptive Management Integration Team. Creating a forum where these issues are worked out, and I think we run the risk of establishing redundant requirements.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think I'm raising this is that this seems like a tailor-made issue for DPIC, that the agencies that are going to do these projects have the success criteria, managing the land, and this is something that should be right up their alley to help us do this, and we should talk about it in the plan. What's the role of DPIC in some of these areas?
Yeah, we have a section, and I won't flip through it right now, but there's what Ron was talking about is as an organization, we address these very important issues of sort of monitoring and overall success of restoration projects two ways. One, by requiring covered actions to come in with an adaptive management plan. We have examples on our website, and that's a review that happens on a project by project basis. And then the other piece, and sort of arguably the one that will have really sort of lasting effect overall, is that we're working with an interagency group. So over the last 3 years, we've been developing this interagency work team that includes DPIC committee member representatives that's really identified sort of the gaps in understanding around adaptive management for restoration. There's a white paper that's out. I think John talked about it.
Yeah, no, actually, it's on the lead scientist report for
Perfect.
today.
See, it's
It
all.
is that there's a strategy that was
Yep.
just put out in April that really addresses how to improve the way adaptive management is implemented for plans, and how to provide some confidence that projects will lead to a functioning ecosystem, that sort of goal.
Right, great. Okay, so maybe we can talk about that.
Oscar has a question, and then Randy, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm sorry about my voice, so I spared you to not say too much today. Yeah, I'm auditioning for a frog in a play. Under my signature, May 17th, on behalf of the Delta Protection Commission, we submitted a letter to the chair and the commission with a handful of questions and recommendations. And as I go through the side-by-side with the staff's analysis, some of it are addressed, some are not, and I'm just wondering what's the process for an appropriate response. I know this is a long process, and there are probably several bites at the apple, but I'm just curious, what's your take on how that's going to be responded to? So certainly that I can report back to the commission that I'm party to.
So staff has had an opportunity to review the comments and would very much also appreciate perspectives from council members on the comments that were offered. I think the other thing is, as part of this public review process, I think we would also benefit from public review of those comments and suggested approaches, and in terms of how we factor in changes or responses to those comments. I think the vehicle for that is likely in the next draft of these materials, and we'll certainly be looking through each of those comments individually and potentially also reaching out to your staff at the commission.
Okay, good enough. Yeah, no, nobody gets everything they want. I'm not expecting that. I just want to know how to respond relative to what was agreed upon at our body.
I think we could also host a meeting sooner rather than later with yourself, with Eric, if we wanted to kind of walk through some of the discussion, some of the ways that we think maybe the current draft already gets at some of the suggestions raised in the letter. I mean, it's really, it's up to you how in-depth and when you want to get together, but I think staff are ready to have those discussions.
Thank you.
At the risk of being too far-reaching, you offered the Cosumnes River Preserve as an example of success. And one of the ingredients there that's absent in other areas is an agency that is responsible for maintaining and operating. That happens to be the Bureau of Land Management. And it just occurred to me as we're rolling this out, maybe that's a candidate for a new member at DPIC. And I'm curious if we have any information about how they achieved the authority to be the responsible agency for maintaining something after it was implemented, and what's the source of funding? Because ultimately, any of this is going to have to be managed, and it's going to have to be funded. And I think the Cosumnes River Preserve serves as an example. And I didn't see much in the narrative referencing that far-reaching approach, but I think we should have some recommendations if we have some thoughts about that.
Maria?
One last thing, I just want to know what we talked about or how we summarized the cost of this ever. Did we ever discuss that? Is it going to be preliminary numbers, no number?
We haven't done a financial impact analysis on the performance measures. We have, there are some estimates of cost from the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, BDCP. I'm thinking there's a slide that we have that shows some sort of estimates from BDCP, and then also the Public Policy Institute of California, PPIC, that's looking overall at sort of how much it costs. I think if I'm remembering correctly, for BDCP, which was about 120,000 acres, the cost was about $4 billion overall. And then there's also $4 billion, yep. There's also some sort of parallel information from the Bay Area. They just passed Measure AA 2 years ago. And so there's some funding estimates that they'll have and acreage that they're restoring. So we haven't pulled all of that together and synthesized it and looked at per acreage costs, yep.
Did we put out a public draft where we don't talk about cost, or just in broad terms? I'm trying to remember on this CSO, I don't think we talked about cost or anywhere else, but it's just, do we need to address it since the takeaway is 60 to 80,000 acres?
I don't know that I would hold up the public review draft for that analysis. We could think about how we can begin to pull those numbers together. Of course, they will be estimates. There's a lot of assumptions that you need to make.
Jessica, I want to put on the table that we talked about a lot of things today and made a lot of comments, and I wouldn't want a schedule that doesn't really have a main driver to hold us up from putting out what we think is the product we want to put out that addresses things that need to be addressed or in the way we want to address it. So, one thing, just speaking on my own behalf, and certainly if 4 people disagree with me, then that's that. But I'd like to know, maybe it's minutes of this workshop and the issues that were raised, so that helps staff and the council kind of understand what changes may need to be changed and how you're going to address that. And I don't know, if we can do it without coming back and having an informational report at the next council meeting, you can get it out, or you can get it out right after the next council meeting. I'm not seeing the downside of us spending just some more time to maybe improve the document. And that's just me again. 4 people think otherwise, then, we can push it out the door as fast as we want. So that, I think we've raised some key issues that need to be addressed in whatever goes out to the public, because that's us saying, hey, this thing is ready to go to the public, and then the public's going to have their comments, and then we're going to make more changes, and then we're going to say, okay, this is what we're going to analyze under CEQA. So, I'm kind of advocating for, hey, let's be thoughtful and step through this a little more slowly.
Any discussion on Ken's point?
Well, I'm unclear. What are you asking
I'm
for?
not sure either.
Oh, I'm asking for, meeting minutes that raise what the council asked and suggested, and how staff's going to maybe address that in changes to the draft. That's all I'm asking for, and if they need more time to do that. Sure.
Well, you want minutes of this meeting?
Yeah, before we send out a public draft, we should see what did we say today, how it relates to the draft document, and, maybe how staff is going to respond to that, where in the draft are they going to address it, or they need more time to address it. Just that we incorporate, what we've discussed today over.
Well, we've already, we
Last
have
2
a good,
hours.
Ken, we've got to, I remember what was said, I made notes myself. It seems to me that there is the timing aspects of this is very important. And we're going to see a public draft, but we're going to be able to comment on that as well and make changes we think is appropriate. I think regurgitating this meeting not necessarily advances the ball much in my mind. I would think that with better approach would be to proceed as we're doing, and then we'll have another bite at the apple, and we can bite it as long as we want, because we can make changes in the future, can we not? Even though it becomes public. That's how
I mean, I don't think what the council prefers, but just because we were asked for input and questions and, clarifications, and I thought there was a discussion and input, whatever format we want to have, to somehow, in some format, to incorporate these. Yeah. That's where I am.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it has the potential to take on a very different flavor if we shift midstream to summary minutes with embedded semi-actionable items that are maybe more important than others. I think you either go action items or you go summary minutes, one or the other, because I think that hybrid is seemingly underscoring certain statements versus other statements, or some questions more than other and I think that's, having tried to manage that as chair, it's frankly impossible and a nightmare. So I would encourage us, as Randy said, to kind of stay the course, and then when it comes back, if there are elements that have not been maybe say underscored or highlighted enough, that then prompts the opportunity for that further dialogue or maybe deeper discussion.
Yeah, I misdescribed what I was, by using the word minutes. I just was asking, I thought that a summary of what comments they received relative to specific places in the plan would be helpful to them to just organize today's workshop. So forget about minutes. I'm just saying, hey, can we see what you got out of this, where you think it relates to specifics in the plan, where you may propose changing, because we're making comments with the expectation that that's input that's somehow going to be addressed, and that's part of the process of getting the first public draft out. Otherwise, we need to make sure we're communicating clearly, they're communicating clearly to us. So it's not detailed minutes or stopping.
I think you're asking of inclusion of the input into the draft that was developed.
Yeah, that's all.
So in whatever format
Yeah.
that will be.
Just let us know
That's how
what-
I got
what
it.
you heard and remind us what we said.
If there's anything that was discussed that was worth to be inputted as, or taken as input, I think that's all it is. Is it the minutes? Is it a part of the draft, not draft? I mean, it's not all the formatting of it, but to take in whatever the discussion was, if there was anything that was discussed that was not included in the document. I think that's how I'm getting it at the end.
I'm happy to. So the schedule moving forward, sort of the plan schedule that we had was we'll take all the input from this meeting. We do a meeting summary. We extensively review the notes. Avery is a master at collecting comments and keeping us organized and on track. excuse me. And so the example, I think, is this staff report for this month. Embedded in there are areas where we had addressed comments from the council, the previous council meeting. So we can plan on doing that again for the August council meeting, both identifying in the meeting summary sort of the highlights and key discussion points from this discussion, and then in the staff report for the public review draft, doing that crosswalk and identifying where those discussion points have been incorporated and changes that have been made. The proposed schedule right now was to release a public review draft that incorporated all the council comments and, depending on sort of the scale of comments, release it in the latter half of July. So sort of July 15th to July 30th. We can, I think we've gotten some really excellent feedback today. I can sort of think, there's sort of, at first blush, I think we can incorporate that feedback over the next few weeks. And
We can even offer to check in, Ken, with you directly on your comments or how.
What did you hear? What did you take from the discussion today, telling us what you took, how it affects the draft, so that when the draft goes out, we're all more, okay, we've all been heard, or, okay, I understand why, what staff's thinking on this is.
Right.
So
Certainly.
that's all I'm asking for. It's
Okay.
not,
And then
Yeah.
we're happy to meet with a subset of council members if there's a briefing group that would like to be held, or we can do sort of how we've done it before, or if there's individual briefing groups that would like to meet before the August council meeting. So this has been really an excellent discussion. It's been really helpful for us. Your thoughts and insights are really helping us fine-tune both the narrative and sort of how we're connecting the policies and the recommendations and performance measures to the core strategy. So thanks for all of your input.
Thank you. Thanks for all the hard work. I see a lot of hungry faces. So, time for lunch. It's now 12:30. How about we take a 20-minute lunch? Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had an enjoyable lunch. Next item, item 5, is an action item, adoption of the May 23 meeting summary. Do I have a motion? Okay, we have Weinberg moved and Maranian seconded. Any discussion? Okay, we had several seconds.
Who moved? Oh, okay, they did.
I yield to the better half.
Okay.
I don't, I'm fine.
Any public comment? Okay, then let's take the vote, starting with Ken on my right.
Weinberg, aye?
Marani and I?
Fiorini, aye.
Tatai and I.
Villegas, aye.
And the meeting summary is adopted. On to the chair's report. Before I start my chair's report, I'd like to give Oscar an opportunity to introduce someone to us.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, we talked a little bit about the importance of engaging our next generation or younger generation, and so I brought with me Delaney Bird, who's in the audience. She's a student at Sarah Lawrence University, and she's studying writing and art history, and she lives in the Delta, and she admittedly said this is the first time she's been in here, and it's actually quite impressive, and so she's impressed by it. So I think we're doing the right thing. So, but I wanted to introduce her to the audience.
Thanks for joining us. So in continuing with the concept from our retreat of the chair and executive officer and others from the council being more visible and doing more outreach. I had the opportunity last month, I was interviewed for an article in the Water Report, and it was a great opportunity to tell the council, the story of the council. So if you get a chance, the article is in the Water Report, take a look at it, and Maven's Notebook reprinted the report with permission. I mean, she reprinted the article with permission. On June 26th, I took a tour of the Delta with John Bureau and Watermaster Michael George. This is a tour similar to the one that Councilmembers Moranian and Damrell and Weinberg took last year, and it is an excellent tour. We zipped around yesterday, literally zipped around in the Delta. We covered so many areas, including the highly channelized parts of Middle and Old River, and I just can't say enough about what a great tour it is, and every time I explore the Delta, I learn something new, especially with tour guides like Michael George and John Bureau. The only other item I'd like to bring up is on July 15, we're having a Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meeting. This is the first time the DPIC has met in the summer, and that meeting will be devoted to getting public input for the governor's water resilience portfolio. The governor issued an executive order asking the California Natural Resources Agency, Cal, EPA, and the California Department of Food and Ag to develop a water resilience portfolio, and they are doing extensive outreach. So if you're interested in providing input for the governor's water resilience portfolio, please come to the July 15 DPIC meeting. That's it. Yes, Judge. Pardon? At the Scopolis Galleria, one of the conference rooms, and details and a final agenda are due out July 8. So with that, I think we can move on to the executive officer's report.
Okay, thanks. I was invited to kick off the Water Education Foundation's annual Bay Delta Tour earlier this month to a group of about 100 with a presentation about the Delta, the role of the council, and the Delta Plan. Several of our fellows and staff were in attendance. The 3-day tour, if you have not been on it before, I highly recommend it. It takes participants throughout the Bay and the Delta by ferry and bus, and they get to hear from a range of speakers who all have very different perspectives on topics including Delta planning, water project operations, agricultural operations, fish passage, levee maintenance, and others. I also had the opportunity yesterday to be hosted as part of a Leadership Sacramento program that I participated in a few years ago. This was an alumni gathering, and we were hosted by the Herringer and Hemley families on their respective estates in Cortland and Clarksburg. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Hemley Cider Company, which is available. The hard cider is available now in stores, but their tasting room will be opening outside of Cortland in August 2019. So it's going to be a really nice asset in the Delta and another stop to add on your tour. I wanted to highlight a rulemaking milestone here at the council. This is in regards to regulatory action for the Delta Plan, what we call policy GP1, and the portion of that which is GP1B2. We definitely hit a milestone worth celebrating. Council members may recall that as part of the council's action to amend the Delta Plan last year, staff were directed to complete rulemaking for 2 Delta Plan regulatory policies. One of those is RRP1, which is the heart of the Delta Levees investment strategy, which the council will consider during an upcoming public hearing, likely at our August meeting. The other was the GP1B2, which as amended requires covered actions to include feasible mitigation measures that we have as part of our Delta plan or substitute equivalent mitigation measures. So this particular rulemaking action added one additional mitigation measure to the items that a covered action must now address. The council held a hearing on this back in January, and staff have been working dutifully ever since with the Office of Administrative Law on a package to support that change. We just got notice from that office that our regs will be effective for GP1B2 on July 1st. That's this Monday. This is one of the last remaining milestones associated with the 2018 Delta Plan Amendment and represents the culmination of a year's worth of staff efforts to prepare documentation. So I really want to express my appreciation for staff for these efforts. It's a process. It's an important process. It's part of the process, your work does not go unnoticed. So included in your binders is the council's May outreach highlights report. And of course, at any time throughout the month, if you have any follow-up questions on this, or if there are items you'd like to see added, please let us know. Included in your binder, we have 3 comment letters that we sent this past month on the topic of Delta Plan implementation and coordination. All of them were to the Department of Water Resources, our biggest client. The first 2 letters address potential covered actions. One on the notice of preparation for an EIR for the State Water Project, where the department intends to seek a new incidental take permit from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. The other letter concerns a 2017 storm damage rehabilitation program, which seeks to repair 29 sites on the levee system damaged during the 2016-2017 winter season. Of course, the letter is kind of our typical letter that states the requirements that the projects may need to meet if they meet the definition of a covered action, and outlining what policies and recommendations might apply. The last letter concerns the draft grant guidelines for the Department of Water Resources Proposition 68 Sustainable Groundwater Management Grant Program. Council staff provided comments to the department requesting that the guidelines include a requirement that grant recipients whose projects occur in the Delta or the Sassoon Marsh engage in early consultation with the council. We currently have no active covered action certifications. In personnel, I just wanted to also give my own quick shout out to Jamie Ondon, who is our University of San Francisco McCarthy Center Fellow for the summer at the Delta Stewardship Council. Jamie recently received her degree in sociology, and she's been working with the council's executive team on a range of projects, including researching how social science can inform communication about climate risk, and also an exploration of environmental justice issues in or relevant to the Delta. This is the 3rd year we've been able to host a McCarthy Fellow for the summer, and I also just got word that our fellow from last summer, Lillian Tu, was admitted into the Capital Fellows program for 2019-2020 in the Assembly Fellows. So we're very happy for her. We're pleased to be able to support these young professionals through a variety of programs at the council, and Jamie was lucky enough to get a slot on the tour yesterday that Susan and members of the State Water Board attended, so she's really getting some great exposure. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Stambrough for our legislative report.
Back again.
I tried to get him to coordinate outfits.
Didn't work. There's always next month. Good afternoon, Chair, Council members. Pleased to be back before you. Before moving into this month's update, I'd like to note that the bills of interest aspect of the tracking form in your binders has been updated to reflect bills that are no longer moving forward this year, as well as to add one bill that I will be discussing later today. Specifically, AB 835 by Assemblymember Quirk related to harmful algal blooms, and SB 332 by Senator Bob Hertzberg relating to the reuse of wastewater has been moved back to the general population of bills, and AB 658, a measure focused on groundwater recharge, has been added. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kate to talk a little bit about the first bill this month.
Hello, council members. I'm California Sea Grant State Fellow Dr. Kate Melanson, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Senate Bill 19, introduced by Senator Dodd from Senate District 3, which includes parts of the Delta, about deploying a network of stream gauges. Stream gauges are scientific tools used to measure characteristics often associated with water quality, such as temperature, flow, clarity, salinity, and water elevation. The information collected from gauges can inform policies related to water management and allocation, flood prediction, infrastructure, and species conservation. However, not all stream gauges are functional, or they may be in non-informative locations. Data from stream gauges may also not be accessible to researchers who need them. SB 19 would require DWR and the State Water Resources Control Board to develop a plan to determine funding needs and opportunities for modernizing, reactivating, and deploying gauges in priority locations. The placement of gauges would be used to address gaps in information necessary for water management and conservation. Data collected by stream gauges would need to be compliant with the Open and Transparent Water Data Act, AB 1755, which would in turn make the data useful to multiple agencies and research groups. This bill aligns with the Delta Plan's goals to use the best available science to make recommendations on the state of water in the Delta. Stream gauges will provide information pertinent to ecosystem health, flooding, and water supply, all of which are issues addressed in the Delta Plan. The addition and maintenance of gauges may provide a reliable means with which researchers and managers can assess a variety of water resource issues and address them. Without adoption, studies requiring gauge readings will continue at a slower pace, extending decision-making timelines. As of now, there has been no opposition to this bill and is supported by 30 groups. The bill recently cleared the Assembly's Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committee and heads next to appropriations.
Thanks, Kate. Mr. Vice Chair.
It sounds like a good idea, but does it take into account that a lot of the activity gauge-wise is conducted by USGS and federal agency involvement?
I think it would coordinate closely with USGS so that they wouldn't duplicate. Actually, in the field yesterday, we saw lots, not stream gauges, but flow gauges in the Delta that, and really learned about the challenge even within the Delta where there's a lot of gauges, there still are some important gaps.
Absolutely. Good question. Thanks, Kate. The second bill I'd like to briefly discuss is AB 658 by Eduardo Garcia. This bill codifies a 2017 executive order by Governor Brown and would create a temporary 5-year permit allowing groundwater recharge projects to divert water during high flow events. According to the author, as implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act evolves, recharge will be critical for bringing groundwater basins into balance, and in order to facilitate this practice, some regulatory challenges need to be addressed. Now, as the council will recall, one of the primary underpinnings of the Delta Plan is the principle of conjunctive use with regards to the state's water resources, specifically coordinating use of surface and groundwater depending on water year type. In practice, surface water is used in wet years, allowing the banking of groundwater, with groundwater being used to supplement deliveries during dry years. The introduced version of this bill also would have defined the diversion of water to underground storage as part of the beneficial use doctrine, something that has been historically contentious, in part due to concerns over the impact that it would have on other water users and other beneficial uses. As a result, that language has since been removed from this measure. AB 658 awaits hearing in Senate Natural Resources and Water, currently enjoys no opposition, and passed off the Assembly floor by a vote of 67-0 at the end of May. And then finally, moving to a brief update from Capitol Hill, where earlier this month, Congressman Garamendi introduced H.R. 830, the Flood Insurance for Farmers Act, which passed out of the House Financial Services Committee as a rider to a larger piece of legislation, H.R. 3167, which reauthorizes the National Flood Insurance Program through 2024. Congressman Garamendi's measure would do two things. The first is aimed at providing farmers access to discounted rates under the National Flood Insurance Program. Specifically, the bill would direct FEMA to develop a new flood mapping zone for basins like those in the Sacramento Valley that are protected by levees that do not currently meet the federally mandated 100-year level of flood protection. Rates would be based on actuarial risk, meaning that levies even providing only 50-year flood protection would result in discounted insurance premiums. Currently, FEMA assumes there is zero protection if a levee does not meet the federally mandated 100-year protection standard. Now, the second noteworthy element of H.R. 830 is that it would allow for variances from flood-proofing requirements for agricultural structures, such as raising barns or silos above potential flood level, something that the author contends has precluded farmers from making capital improvements on their operations or securing the necessary funding to do so. Supporters of H.R. 830 include Sacramento and San Joaquin counties, the Northern California Water Association, and the California Rice Commission. And I'll certainly track that measure as it goes forward, particularly since it is also a reauthorization of the National Flood Insurance Program, something that we opine on as being a very important aspect to reducing overall flood risk in the Delta. And with that, Madam Chair, that concludes my report.
Great, thank you both. Is there any public comment? I see none, so I think that takes care of, oh, Ken, sorry.
Gee, on AB 658, you said they took that language about, was it that groundwater recharge was a beneficial use? And
That's correct.
So
They removed it from the bill.
because there was opposition
Correct.
in light of Sigma and a critically overdrafted groundwater basin, recharging that basin is not a beneficial use because that may threaten me down. So that's where we're at in.
It's certainly an ongoing discussion. This is something
Okay.
that I know Assemblymember Eggman has introduced on numerous occasions in the last couple of years, and has
Okay.
continues to attempt to address that intersection of issue. Yeah.
So conversely, if surface water is used for groundwater recharge, is that an illegal use of surface water?
Well, I guess it would depend on who you would be potentially injuring.
I'm concerned I might go to jail.
A waste and unreasonable use. Well, they did leave something in there that says surface water to underground storage for beneficial use that advances the sustainability goal of a groundwater basin. So they left that in there, but they took everything else out. So it's like, well, yeah, it's, sort of a beneficial use, so it's not a waste and unreasonable use.
I think you're touching obviously on a reality of as Sigma implementation continues to ramp up, what that will ultimately mean for a variety of the water resources. Obviously, another aspect that we've discussed here is the impact that Sigma implementation could have on reducing overall reliance on the Delta and what the balance and trade-off there will be as well.
Okay, if no further questions or comments, thank you both.
Thank you.
I have nothing further as well.
Okay. On to file item 9, lead scientist. John.
Great, thank you. I have a few things to highlight besides what's in the binder, and I want to lead off with the updated Delta Science Plan that you have at your desk, and this is hot off the press. It was just printed Tuesday. You're the first to get it, besides staff at the Science Program and the Stewardship Council, so I think it's truly a major accomplishment. Over a year in the making. I think Jessica Pearson highlighted, she really likes the subtitle, Visions, Principles, and Approaches for Integrating and Coordinating Science in the Delta. And I think that really sums up what the science plan is all about and bringing together science to address the challenging management questions that we have out there. So I want to also thank Yumi Henneberry and all of the science program staff that Yumi really led the charge to get this completed. So I hope you get a chance to look it over and enjoy it. Not only is the content outstanding, but the graphics, it's really very, very well done visually. So the communications staff as well at the Stewardship Council really helped to make it a really appealing document. And many of the actions that are in there are actually already being worked on and implemented. The DPIC Science Initiative that's moving forward really builds on much of the recommendations in the plan. The monitoring efforts that I'm going to talk about, or the monitoring review. So there's many links to what we're currently doing, and we're working now to get the plan widely distributed and really think hard about how we can really make some progress, more progress in terms of implementation of it. Also in your packet is the by the numbers report, and since I've forgotten it over the last couple months, I want to just highlight you and direct you to look at the by the numbers report that Kate has put together, and you'll see that we're in good conditions pretty much everywhere. Everything is in green. The one thing that isn't is the Northern Sierra snowpack that I think probably with the warm weather that we had in the early part of the summer and the relatively low elevations in the Northern Sierra, that's down to 73% of normal, but still overall very good numbers in terms of flow, salinity, reservoir storage throughout. Two other short announcements. I also want to let you know that we just recently put out a flyer and are starting the recruitment process for the Delta Independent Science Board members that are being termed out. So 6 of the 10 Delta Independent Science Board members will be leaving over the next year and a half. And so we're undertaking a major effort to recruit nationally to bring in some really outstanding scientists to replace those that we currently have. And so we have a flyer out that we're widely distributing through our network and through a number of professional societies, and really trying to bring in addition to the current expertise, bring in some more social scientists. And so that's an ongoing effort, and applications for that are due September 30th. So if you know of anyone who you think would be a good candidate, please let me know. And then we also just recently sent out initial announcements for our science fellows. So remember, we have the Sea Grant fellows that work here at the Stewardship Council. In addition, we support fellows who are students and postdocs to do their research and carry on their research. We usually support about 10 to 15 every 2 years. And the announcement for that, the formal announcement will be going out shortly. Applications for that are due in early October. And so we want to spread the word to students. For the first time this year, in addition to PhD students, we'll be supporting master's students and also postdocs. So with that, then I want to get into some of the items that are in your report. First is a brief summary of a paper that was in Nature Scientific Reports. It's entitled Dynamic Flood Modeling is Essential to Assess the Coastal Impacts of Climate Change. It's by Patrick Barnard, a very well-respected scientist at USGS who works on coastal processes, and a number of his colleagues from USGS and elsewhere. Really the take-home message here is that sea level rise is really critical to understanding coastal flooding into the future, but it's not just sea level rise. And so they developed a model called Cosumnes that is the Coastal Storm Modeling System, and is really designed to look at multiple aspects of water level. And given the importance of elevation and water level here in the Delta, thinking about sea level rise obviously is very critical, but when we're thinking about the vulnerability assessment and the ecosystem amendment and planning into the future, it's not just sea level rise. It's also river inflow that is going to affect water levels and flooding. And then on the coast, really one of the key things they've incorporated is storm surge. Storm surge probably isn't as big of an important effect in the Delta. It's not even as big of an effect in the Bay as it is on the coast, but it still is something to incorporate. And so this new tool is just a way to incorporate a broad mix of factors, and something that I think we should be aware of. It currently, unfortunately, has only been developed for the coast, but the same sort of approach is really thinking about these multiple factors is being considered in the approach that we're using in the climate vulnerability assessment. And then actually the other thing to think about is king tide. So you saw when we went out on the walk, Mike Moran talked all about all those different factors as well: king tide, sea level, river inflows. So these models are being improved to incorporate those multiple factors. Any questions on that paper? Okay, so a couple other items then. One is the Delta Independent Science Board's Monitoring Enterprise Review. I think you all realize how monitoring is really one of the critical components of science, along with the kinds of research the focused research that we're funding through the solicitation and these fellowships. Actually, most of the funding in the Delta towards science really does go towards monitoring. And so there's a lot of interest in trying to understand the efficiency of that monitoring. Is it addressing the management questions of interest? Are we coordinating it in a reasonable way? And so given all of that interest, the Independent Science Board has been working on their review. As part of their review, the Stewardship Council has supported contractor ESSA Consulting, ESSA, from Vancouver, British Columbia, to create an inventory of all of the monitoring efforts that are currently going on in the Bay. And they had a workshop back in April to bring together all of a range of agency staff and other stakeholders to give them input so that they are aware of all of the different efforts that are ongoing, and to really get some input on management issues. Are there things that we should be monitoring that we aren't monitoring? So they had about 60 people, a 2-day workshop that I think was really successful in raising awareness about this project that's moving forward, and doing some outreach so that we will be certain that they're getting, really are encompassing the broad range of monitoring that's including. And I should highlight, it's not just, it's physical monitoring, biological monitoring, biochemical monitoring, social science focused monitoring. They're really trying to look at all of that. And their report will be due in the fall, their inventory of the monitoring, and that will be the basis that the Independent Science Board will use to write their review and their report that will be completed sometime in 2020. Then let's see, the other thing I wanted to highlight relates to adaptive management and came up in the discussion of the ecosystem amendment, and that's this recent report that came out in April, the Delta Conservation Adaptive Management Action Strategy. And this is an effort that's led by staff within the science program, the adaptive management unit within the science program, but is a multi-agency effort. So Jessica Law mentioned the Interagency Adaptive Management Implementation Team, and that's a group of actually, there's probably about 30 or 40 participants who've helped to put together this report to think about how do we do adaptive management more effectively for individual projects? How can we ensure that that everyone is aware of the requirements for adaptive management and preparing appropriate adaptive management plans for their covered actions or for any other kinds of projects in the Delta? The goals of this strategy are to improve coordination of adaptive management efforts, to provide technical assistance where needed for the preparation of adaptive management plans, and to fill knowledge gaps and identify areas where we can improve the approaches that we're currently taking. In order to achieve those, the strategy lays out things that we can do around supporting projects, around developing conceptual models and incorporating conceptual models into adaptive management plans, around improved monitoring and linking monitoring and research efforts directly up to the adaptive management that's occurring, incorporating experiments into ongoing projects so that we can learn from them and improve future projects, data management and the open data kinds of issues that we've talked about in the past, synthesis and analysis, and communication efforts. So the full range, the whole scope of how we prepare for adaptive management, implement it, and take advantage of the knowledge that we gain from it. And it's a really nice, concise overview of the specific actions that can be done to achieve our efforts in that regard. So I'd encourage you to take a look at it. And then last, I wanted to mention the brown bag seminar that we had last month. Rich Batuk from EPA, recently retired from EPA, and the chief, or the executive officer for science and implementation in the Chesapeake Bay program, came and actually spent a day and a half here, not just did a brown bag and then met with staff from our agency as well as from a number of other agencies to highlight the lessons that can be learned from Chesapeake Bay in terms of coordinating science and management on a large scale. So the three-part series looks at Bay Delta connections and how do we improve our science and the application of our science to management issues on a large scale, not just in the Delta, but linking with the Bay. Actually, just earlier this week, we had the second of the series. Stephanie Fong from California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the IEP gave a presentation on water quality issues in the Delta. And next month, Jim Klern will carry that on with another. It's all focused around water quality as an example of how we can coordinate those efforts. So Rich had some really powerful insights from the Chesapeake Bay program. I think some of the differences that are notable are that they have a much more sort of centralized program than we have. We have a very dispersed mix of agencies working across the issues here. They also have significantly more federal funding from the EPA to direct that sort of coordinated effort. And in many ways, they have a simpler set of problems to deal with. It's clearly a complicated system, but they focus primarily on water quality issues and eutrophication issues, algal blooms, and the impacts on seagrass in the Bay. And they've had great successes over the last 15 years in reducing nutrient inputs and improving water quality. And so he highlighted the need to really get that buy-in across the agencies. Many of the things that I think we think about, but it was really valuable to hear the perspective from Chesapeake Bay and some of the successes that they've had. So with that, I'll take any questions. What's that?
Sorry, Madam Chair. The notation here says that the water's actually gotten better with nearly 50% increase in the population with the establishment of the partnership in Chesapeake Bay.
They truly, that along with the Tampa Bay water quality improvements are probably the two best examples in the country of coordinated efforts that have addressed water quality. Ken.
Thank you, John.
I think Ken has.
Oh, Ken has a
just kind of following up on Oscar's question, but both of those are pretty heavily regulated environments, aren't they? Chesapeake Bay and Tampa Bay?
Yes.
And more so than even our regulatory regime here?
I think more coordinated.
More coordinated.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good point.
Similar, they're federal regulations, so they apply here, but I think it's a more focused, coordinated effort.
Okay, do we have any public comment? Deirdre?
I had some handouts for you too. So this is with respect to sea level rise in the Delta and the Delta levees and the new Delta conveyance planning. So we're sort of updating our assessment of Delta levees for high sea level rise at 2 meters by 2,100 under high and up to 10 feet by extreme. But we really haven't, not only, the Delta conveyance has only been assessed for 4.5 feet, 55 inches. This is an old number, and I've discovered last year that they never assessed whether the intakes would stay fresh if the North Delta levees failed. So you can go back and look, and they were evaluating the different intakes to use, and they just assumed that the intake location didn't matter based on this modeling that didn't look at any levee failures north of Bolden Island and Isleton. So I have been strongly recommending, and I think it would be really important for investment in some modeling of what kind of salinity intrusion we might get in the future with high sea level rise and multiple levee failure in the Delta. So I'm recommending it both to the DCA and also bringing it before this council. I'd really like to see this as part of the governor's directive to assess efforts to modernize conveyance, because we've learned so much about sea level rise since this modeling was done in 2010. Thank you.
Can you provide us a color copy,
Yes,
maybe email it
yes,
to us?
I apologize.
No, that's fine.
I will
That's
email
fine.
it to you.
Yeah, I think color's important on this one. Thanks.
Apologies.
Thank you, Deirdre. Are there any other public comments? No? Okay. On to item 11, preparation for our next council meeting. Our next council meeting will be July 25, and as to location, I'll look to Jessica.
In Sacramento, in our building, we're exploring the option of making it a teleconference for our traveling members, but we'll have more detail on that once we figure out the logistics.
Great, thank you. With that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.